Chapter 486. Yesterday, when I read the comment section, especially one of the posts, I suddenly felt as if I had walked into a war or leisure mood. I was a little scared. I admit that a certain comrade was right. I really don't have any experience. Brother Fan also doesn't have any experience. Sigh. P.S. Still pulling for monthly votes. Don't find it troublesome. I'm preparing to poll for 7 days. I had things to do during the day and didn't have time to write. In the end, I went online and saw that there were so many votes. It is truly exciting and scary. The general was not wearing armor. He also did not carry the longbow on his back. Even so, Fan Xian still lowered his head slightly and narrowed his eyes. Only then was he able to resist the thick arrow intent emanating from the other party's body. Arrows were used to kill, but the arrow intent was not a killing intent. It was a kind of aura that seemed to tear apart a person's outer clothing and reveal the timid and pale skin underneath. Even with Fan Xian's powerful mental control and strength, he was still suppressed by this aura. It meant that this general's cultivation was truly a level higher than his. Northern Governor Yin Xiaoi, an absolute warrior above the 9th level. He was the person most likely to challenge a great grandmaster. Greetings, Governor. Fan Xian piled on a smile and gently bowed toward Yin Xiaoi. Yin Xiaoi stood in the long corridor. The deep gaze in his eyes was like spring water washing over Fan Xian's face. After hearing Fan Xian's words, he did not have any reaction. In a slightly raspy voice, he said, "I will be returning to the north in a few days. Every time I think of the lanterns hanging high in the sky and the martial conference in the palace, I'm truly disappointed that I won't be able to spar with the commissioner." The so-called martial conference was just a boxing match held by the court. This was Fan Xian's understanding. Furthermore, he knew that in such a country where military service and martial power were prized, if Yin Xiaoi truly went crazy and disregarded the emperor's face and challenged him in the palace, would Yin Xiaoi go crazy? Fan Xian knew that the people on the eldest princess side were all crazy, particularly after their only son, Yin Shindu, had been stabbed to death by the cute 13th Wang he had ordered. Could he beat Yin Xiaoi? Fan Xian asked himself. It was impossible for him to spray poison in the hall, and he certainly could not use crossbows. In a direct confrontation of martial arts, he was still some distance away from a top 9th level ace. Although it was impossible for Yin Xiaoi to use his famous bow in the palace, he was not stupid enough to think that all of Yin Xiaoi's extraordinary skills were on that bow. Therefore, if the martial arts discussion became a reality, even if Old Hong could save his life in the end, he would definitely be seriously injured. During the military intelligence conference, the emperor had Yin Xiaoi return to the north early. This was in accordance with Fan Xian's request. After all, he didn't even want to be wounded. But looking at the current situation, Yin Xiaoi's disappointment and anger could not be concealed at all. Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. He smiled warmly at this powerful figure in the military and said, "Governor, I thought you misunderstood something." Yin Xiaoi was silent for a moment, then said, "I just want to experience Commissioner Fan's little tricks." Fan Xian was also silent for a moment. He then raised his hands in a salute and said, "In these peaceful times, it is better to have less fighting and killing." In the long corridor, only Fan Xian and Yin Xiaoi stood facing each other. A sense of danger rose involuntarily. Fan Xian knew that in the royal palace, Yin Xiaoi would not attack no matter what, so he was not very worried. He used his clear eyes to calmly watch the other party. Cough, cough. A few coughs rang out. It was not old Eunuch Hong. Rather, it was a slightly short figure with an aura like that of Dong Mountain. He suddenly appeared beside the two of them. Yi Zhong. Fan Xian smiled slightly, thinking that this person had come at just the right time. He did not want to have another clash of gazes with Yin Xiaoi. "Governor Yin, Commissioner Fan, this is a restricted area of the palace. Don't make too much noise." When Yi Zhong was in charge of the Jingdo garrison, Fan Xian had not yet been born. Yin Xiaoi was still hunting in the mountains. With his seniority and status, the weight of his words was much greater. Yin Xiaoi paused slightly and turned his head to bow. Fan Xian smiled and asked, "Uncle Yi, long time no see. How are you in Dingzhou? With Yi Zhong's interruption, Yin Xiaoyi stopped talking. Yi Zhong could also see the problem between Yin Xiaoyi and Fan Xian. He furrowed his brows and thought. The death of Yin Xiaoyi's only son had always been an unsolved case. Why was Yin Xiaoyi so certain that Fan Xian did it? I still have official business to attend to, so I'll take my leave now. Fan Xian took this opportunity to quickly escape. Yi Zhong nodded. Yin Xiaoyi slowly said, Sir Fan Jr., you must take care of yourself. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He knew what the other party meant by these words. A heroic feeling surged from the bottom of his heart. He raised his hands to the sky and laughed. With the protection of the heavens, there is no need for Governor Yin to worry. Yin Xiaoyi's smile suddenly became bone-piercingly cold. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly. The heavens cannot hide from my eyes. Fan Xian, you will die at my hands. Everyone was in the royal palace, and Yi Zhong was still by his side. Yet, Yin Xiaoyi was arrogant enough to say such threatening words. Yi Zhong couldn't help but furrow his brows, but he didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help but shake his head. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law and had long belonged to that side. However, Yin Xiaoyi did not care about anything in front of him and said he would kill the emperor's illegitimate son in the royal palace. He was indeed arrogant and crazy to the extreme. He gently brushed his sleeves and raised his face confidently. Yin Xiaoyi, I'm willing to bet that you will die at my hands first, and it will be an incomparably stupid death. After saying this, he raised his hands to Yi Zhong. Without another glance at Yin Xiaoyi, he slowly walked in the direction of the palace gate. Yin Xiaoyi narrowed his eyes and watched his gradually disappearing figure with extreme coldness. Yi Zhong also watched Fan Xian's figure and wondered where exactly this young man got his confidence from. He had already made arrangements for a few years. Don't let some unexpected changes happen because of Fan Xian. As he thought this, he turned his head to look at Yin Xiaoyi and sighed. Patting his shoulder, he said, My condolences. However, in the palace, be careful that the walls have ears. After all, he is not a normal person. He is the emperor's son. Yin Xiaoyi's expression did not change. Coldly, he said, I also have a son. Walking to the palace gate, Fan Xian's expression had long recovered its calm. Yin Xiaoyi and he had long been in a life-and-death situation. They just needed a suitable place and time to put it into practice. Last time, the situation he had arranged had been broken by Eunuch Hong. Next time, would he fall into Yin Xiaoyi's trap? There was also 13th Wang. After killing Yin Shendu, he had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. As Fan Xian calculated in his heart, he walked out of the palace. Then, as expected, he saw the great prince beside him, the only military general in the royal family. What did you say to Yin Xiaoyi? The great prince asked in a low voice beside him. His son died, and he's randomly biting people, Fan Xian replied with a smile. He said he wanted to kill me. The great prince furrowed his brows and said with slight anger, What an arrogant tone. Doesn't he see where he is? Fan Xian thought for a moment, and then said seriously to the great prince, Yin Xiaoyi's intention to rebel is set. I don't think the emperor can't see it, but you have to be careful. The great prince was slightly startled. He wondered where the word rebel came from. Fan Xian climbed into the carriage and headed toward the manor. On the way, he was still thinking about this question. The emperor would not be unable to see Yin Xiaoyi's surging desire to fight and kill. Why did he still release the tiger back in the mountains? Wasn't he still imprisoning him in Jingdou? It was an interesting question. He laughed at himself in his heart. Who knew how much later, when Yin Xiaoyi came to kill him, or when he killed Yin Xiaoyi, the world would certainly become very interesting. Presumably, the mahjong table the emperor was playing would also be on the eve of a draw. On the 15th day of the first month, there was no snow or wind in Jingdou. After nightfall, colorful lanterns hung high throughout the city. People weaved through the dry streets. Men and women used the reflection of the beautiful lights to search for the faces that moved their hearts and avoid the harassment that annoyed them. The young ladies brought their serving girls around with blushing faces as they played. The polite young men maintained a distance that was neither too far nor too close and quietly watched them play. That night, spring arrived early. Who knew how many shoes had fallen off on the street? And who knew how many tender skin had been touched by those hands? Tailing and investigating, movements and probing continued happily in the night. The people controlled by hormones collectively sank into a matchmaking activity without a matchmaker. For the Qin court, the joy of the people could not affect its sternness. Although large palace lanterns were hung in the corner of the royal palace, and some riddles had been prepared inside the palace for the Empress Dowager, Empress, and other nobles to enjoy, even the square, black, and gray building of the Overwatch Council had red lanterns hung under Fan Xian's orders. But it was still sternness. The movement of the military had begun long before the 15th. The governor of the north had led his personal soldiers back north. He was going to Zhangzhou and Yinjing to block the sharp gaze of northern Qi's famous general. Yizhong had also returned to Dingzhou. The court once again increased the number of soldiers to the west. Taking elite soldiers from the remaining 5 roads of Central Army, they replenished the Dingzhou area and formed an invincible army of 100,000 people. When spring arrived, these 100,000 soldiers would push another 200 li to the west. It was called pressure. If there was any strange movement between Shi Hu and the northern man who had marched thousands of li south, these invincible soldiers of the Qin kingdom would find an opportunity to launch a surprise attack and tear large swaths of the Hu people's flesh and blood. The military was an important matter. Although it was only a movement and the battle had yet to start, the 6 ministries had long become busy in order to deal with logistics. Fortunately, the Qin kingdom thrived on the military. All matters had long been set in stone. The cooperation between the various ministries appeared orderly and efficient. When facing outsiders, the Qin kingdom was always this united. At this moment, no one remembered the strife between the princes and Fan Xian's terror. Fan Xian had also been busy for a number of days. Because the Overwatch Council was responsible for providing intelligence to the military, it was also responsible for examining the equipment and weapons sent up by the various departments. All sorts of matters piled up at once. Fortunately, he had Yan Bingyun's help. Only on the night of the 15th could Fan Xian enter the palace and take a look at the legendary martial conference. The battles in the palace were indeed exciting. There were indeed a number of aces in the Qin kingdom. However, without Yin Xiaoyi and Fan Xian's battle to the death, the officials did not seem to have much interest. No one was stupid enough to take the initiative to challenge Fan Xian to a battle. They were not Yin Xiaoyi. They did not want to die. On the 22nd of the first month, the nerves in the court and palace that had become tense because of the strange movements on the border had gradually grown used to it and gradually relaxed. They had to live as they should. When it was time to eat, they still had to eat. When it was time to dress, they still had to dress. They couldn't let the nobles in the palace not have a few new clothes for the new year. Thus, the embroidery bureau in the palace sent out a team to a certain shop to take over the embroidered cloth that had been shipped from the west. Because the empress in the Eastern Palace did not like the embroidery colors that had been sent up from Jiangnan last year, she had requested an edict ahead of time to order another batch. Extra errands like this that did not go through the palace treasury or the palace were often good opportunities for the main eunuchs to make a lot of money. Just the commissions and gifts alone were probably worth 30% of the price of the embroidered cloth. With one trip out of the palace, they could easily take a few thousand liang of silver notes into their sleeves. In the past, because the second prince was favored, this errand had always been handled by eunuch Dai in Lady Shu's palace. However, this year, it was clear that the second prince was not as favored as in previous years. Eunuch Dai, because of his corruption and involvement in the Hanging Temple assassination case, had lost most of his power. Thus, the major eunuchs in the palace were all envious. They all began to move, wanting to take over old Dai's position. However, after asking around for some news, the major eunuchs, including Eunuch Yao and Eunuch Ho, all stopped their activities. They had heard that this year, the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace, Hong Zhu, was in charge. Hong Zhu's surname was Hong, and he was deeply trusted by the empress. Additionally, the emperor seemed to like this nimble little eunuch very much. Thus, his position in the palace grew day by day. Even someone like Eunuch Yao did not want to stand in the way of Hong Zhu's gradual rise to glory, so he chose to give way. In the morning, the palace guard stood guard outside a large shop. They yawned endlessly because they believed that no one would come looking for trouble. There were no nobles in the shop, only a eunuch. Every time they thought of how these strong soldiers could not follow the Dingzhou army on a western expedition and had to protect a mere eunuch, these guards were not in a good mood. Naturally, they relaxed a great deal. In a quiet room on the second floor, Hong Zhu was carefully examining the number of threads and color of the embroidered cloth. Although it was a good opportunity to earn commissions, he had to be careful when working for the empress. As for the shopkeeper of this dongi shop, he had long been chased out by him. Hong Zhu's fingertips trembled slightly. It was clear that he was uneasy. He didn't know when or how Sir Fan Jr. would be able to hide it from the guard's eyes and ears to meet with him. Just as he was feeling extremely uncomfortable, the light in the room suddenly bent slightly. A slight change occurred in the light and shadow. Who is it? Hong Zhu turned around cautiously, but did not call out this question. Fan Xian, who was wearing commoner clothing, rubbed the corners of his brows that had been glued painfully after his disguise. He made a hand gesture toward Hong Zhu and then took out a piece of jade from his clothes and handed it over. This piece of jade was the one he had thought of many ways to get from the Luo Chuan gang a few days ago. Hong Zhu accepted the jade with some confusion and glanced at it. He felt that this piece of jade looked very unfamiliar, but it seemed to be something used in the palace. Furthermore, the style and lines of the jade gave him a familiar feeling. This is something from the Eastern Palace, Fan Xian said quietly. Hong Zhu pressed his lips together and said, "What do I need to do?" Fan Xian set a date and furrowed his brows. "Every time a crown prince goes to Guangxin Palace, it should be this day. You have a lot of information in the palace. See if it's accurate." Hong Zhu thought back and calculated a bit. He then nodded his head. Fan Xian relaxed. This date was the conclusion Wang Qinian had come to after spending every day watching the Imperial Relatives Manor. The Imperial Relatives Manor was responsible for sending medicine to the palace, so the date was basically stable. Fan Xian stared into Hong Zhu's eyes and said, "After the embroidered cloth enters the palace, according to usual practice, the Eastern Palace will distribute it to the various palaces. You should know what time it is if the Empress has a serving girl send the embroidered cloth to Guangxin Palace. Usually, it's the afternoon of the second day." Hong Zhu was a bit nervous. He didn't know what this matter had to do with the embroidered cloth. "Very good. You're responsible for buying it. Then, delay the time for this batch of embroidered cloth to enter the palace," Fan Xian said. "Calculate the time well. Make sure that when the Eastern Palace sends the embroidered cloth into Guangxin Palace, the Crown Prince will also be there." Hong Zhu picked at the itchy pimple on his face and asked with confusion, "What use does this have?" Fan Xian didn't reply. Hong Zhu looked thoughtfully at the jade amulet in his hand and suddenly said with astonishment, "This seems to have been used by the Empress before." "Correct," Fan Xian ordered seriously. "It was secretly sold out of the palace by your eunuchs. These little bastards are quite daring." Hong Zhu had completely forgotten the current situation and unconsciously returned to his role as the head eunuch of the Eastern Palace. He spoke viciously. He was a major eunuch and had plenty of places to make money. He didn't need to use such petty tricks. Then, he suddenly came to his senses. He knew that Sir Fan Jr. would not simply have him straighten out the order in the Eastern Palace. He looked at Fan Xian's not-quite-there face and asked in a trembling voice, "This piece of jade, how do we deal with it?" "Put it in the room of the serving girl who sends the embroidered cloth into Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then sighed. "What we need to do next is very simple. Make the Empress remember this piece of jade. What will happen then?" Hong Zhu was a clever man and immediately understood. However, he still did not connect this entire matter to Guangxin Palace. However, Fan Xian didn't have much time to explain. He heard the footsteps coming from downstairs and moved closer to Hong Zhu's ear to give him a few reminders. He told him not to worry about anything and only needed to do these 3 things properly. He didn't need to make any unnecessary movements, pay attention to his own safety, and don't get dragged into it. The sound of knocking came from outside. Fan Xian's body flashed and disappeared from the room. The owner of the shop entered respectfully and asked if this eunuch had any other orders. Hongzhu looked at the empty space beside him and suddenly became absent-minded. A moment later, he thought of Fan Xian's orders. He furrowed his brows and squeezed out a sharp voice. This cloth seems to be different from the one the Empress asked for. The owner paused and complained bitterly in his heart. Eunuch, what are you saying? I am just a small businessman. How could I lie to the nobles in the palace? As he spoke, a few banknotes were shoved into Hongzhu's sleeves. Hongzhu's gaze flickered and was satisfied with the amount. However, he still couldn't let go. He furrowed his brows and said, Is there a problem with the yellow dandelion in this pattern? It looks a bit off, particularly the thread used in these satin. Why do I feel it isn't thick enough? How could it be? The owner cursed in his heart and said with a pained expression, This is authentic Western cloth, 3 layers of blended fabric, 36 stitches. There is nothing better. Hongzhu chuckled and said, Is that so? But there is no rush. Go back and check it carefully. I'll come back to take it in a few days. The owner panicked and said, Eunuch, this is something the Empress in the palace urgently wants. If it's too late, not only me, but even you. These words made Hongzhu unhappy. He glared and darkly said, Listen carefully. When the palace wants this cloth, it will depend on when I am happy. What kind of identity does the Empress have? How could she remember such a small matter? After saying this, Hongzhu brushed his sleeves and went downstairs. His expression was very unfriendly. The owner of the shop followed behind. He only knew that he had offended this eunuch and cried out bitterly in his heart. He wondered how many banknotes he would have to shove into this eunuch's body if this dragged on for a few days. He had no idea that Hongzhu's expression was unfriendly because he was afraid and excited. Chapter 487. Last night, my son actually jumped to the 2nd place. I really can't stand it. I sincerely thank everyone for your votes. Although I don't know how many days I'll be happy, I'll at least be glorious. My face is shining. I forgot to wish everyone a happy holiday yesterday. I'll make it up to you all today. Also, I've put Dun Huai's comments on the public page. Everyone can take a look. I really like his words. After returning to the capital for a month, Fan Xian smelled something very clearly and understood some things. The most important was, of course, the words the second prince had once said to him in private. He had to admit that second brother's analysis and judgment were very accurate. If the situation continued to develop like this, his situation would become extremely awkward and unclear. Although the Qin kingdom's silent and deeply popular emperor had coldly and mercilessly provoked his sons to fight each other in the past few years, the Qin kingdom's emperor, who was silent and deeply popular among the people, had been very coldly provoking his sons to fight each other. But this kind of fighting had to be controlled to a certain extent. Although he was cold and valiant, he was not a pervert. As long as he was not a pervert, he would not watch his sons kill each other. The second prince of the past and the current Fan Xian were actually just whetstones the emperor used to sharpen the crown prince. If the crown prince, this newly forged sword, broke on these 2 whetstones, presumably the emperor would not hesitate to replace him. The competition between A and B had always been this intense. The crown prince's current performance was not bad. Although he didn't have many opportunities to display his brilliance and heat, and his blade was sealed in its sheath, never to see the light of day, this crown prince was clearly not a weakling. It was just that the opportunities to shine in the past had all been snatched away by his brothers. If the sword was kept in its sheath, the emperor would be at ease because the crown prince's choice was smart enough and had the wisdom of forbearance. The emperor had been watching all of this coldly the entire time. He wanted to clearly see his sons' hearts, so he had always given the crown prince many chances and enough time. If the crown prince continued to wait calmly like this, the emperor might not make any major changes. For Fan Xian, not changing was something he could not accept. Many years later, once the crown prince took the throne and the empress became the empress dowager, what would Fan Xian do? Just as the second disciple said, the one who should be anxious right now should be Fan Xian. However, the emperor would not allow Fan Xian to do anything too out of line. Although Fan Xian still didn't understand why the emperor would remain silent, he suddenly thought of something. He didn't remember if it was something Chun Pingping, his father, or his father-in-law had once said, but it was something very important. The emperor was suspicious and sensitive, but the emperor wanted too much. He wanted to unify the world. He wanted to obtain the most glorious name in history. However, if he wanted to continue to be glorious, the Qing emperor had to care about history's evaluation of him. If he changed the crown prince, this matter would be recorded in the history books as a test of his virtue and ability. If his sons killed each other, it would leave a thick and heavy mark. Fan Xian put down the teacup in his hand and sucked in a cold breath. He finally understood the reason for the emperor's silence. The emperor still hoped that the matter of the fight for the throne could be resolved peacefully and that the Qing kingdom could be passed on in a gentle manner. As emperors, there were only two things they desired. One was territory, and the other was eternal fame. The emperor refused to give up on either of them. A glimmer of a cold smile flashed through the corners of Fan Xian's eyes. He said to himself, throwing his sons into the jungle to be educated, and then, in the end, he wants to twist his sons, who have already become bloodthirsty beasts, back onto the path of humanity. This emperor's thinking is a bit too beautiful. The struggle for imperial power gradually eased under the emperor's powerful suppression and secret declaration. Fan Xian would not allow the situation to continue like this. He had to force the emperor to make up his mind earlier. When he was in Jiangnan, Fan Xian had already guessed that the old man in Shun Garden had the same thoughts as him. He was also using all kinds of methods to influence the emperor's thoughts, trying to make the emperor make up his mind earlier. However, what he didn't know was that Chun Pingping had skillfully woven a large net, including the true cause of Great Master Sansher's death and the relationship between the Juanshan Conference and the eldest princess. All these heavy bombs had not been able to make the emperor truly make up his mind to resolve these matters. Thus, Chun Pingping had chosen the most ruthless move. This move had been used by Fan Xian without Chun Pingping's knowledge. An old man and a young man worked hard together for the same goal. They planned quietly and wanted to play with the Qing emperor's emotions and use the emperor's paranoia and jealousy hidden in the depths of his heart to achieve the goal they wanted. In this world, there were not many people like Chun Pingping and Fan Xian who understood the Qing emperor's heart. There were even fewer people who dared to plot and provoke the Qing emperor's emotions. When it came down to it, it only showed that the leaders of the Overwatch Council were all ruthless and shameless people who did not care about their lives. However, Chun Pingping's goal was far from just having the crown prince step down. On this point, he thought further than Fan Xian, and his intentions were wilder. The first month was about to end. Fan Xian's trip back to the capital was also about to end. His subordinates were all preparing for their return to Jiangnan. He made the best use of the remaining time to keep his father and Chun Pingping company for a few days. These two elders were getting on in years. He was often in Jiangnan and was unable to fulfill his filial duties. He truly felt apologetic. The Bao had gone from Danzhou to Hangzhou and then to Wuzhou. After spending a new year with Prime Minister Lin, he had also returned to Jingdou. Fan Xian had to accompany his brother-in-law for a good stroll through Jingdou. Big Dumb and Little Dumb were having a good time. However, time was tight, so it was hard to avoid a sense of panic. Amidst this meticulously arranged and tight schedule, Fan Xian followed the second group Deng Zi you had left behind and once again headed north. The Chamber of Commerce traveling in the north needed this talented youth to manage. It was never good to leave Shangjing for too long. Ever since Fan Xian had confirmed that matter, his feelings toward the north had sunk into some kind of dilemma. Although he was more confident about his brother and sister's safety in the north, he unconsciously wanted to avoid something. Thus, he did not have Cija bring a secret letter to the northern Qi emperor. The other people in the Qinian unit also began to busy themselves. Hong Chanqing took Fan Xian's order and went to Jiangnan ahead of time. This was a very important matter. Fan Xian told him to inform Su Wenmao to get ready. Before the matter in the palace exploded and the news reached Jiangnan, they had to create a perfect time difference to swallow the entire Ming family. Mu Tai and Mu Feng of the First Bureau were also busy with official matters in Jingdou and could not follow by Fan Xian's side at all times. Sir Yin Jr. was busy in the Overwatch Council coordinating daily affairs and avoiding the marriage introductions of the noble ladies in Jingdou. He was miserable beyond words. For a moment, Fan Xian's only capable confidant was Wang Qinian, the old man. Fan Xian was eating with Dabao in Wang Qinian's garden when he suddenly thought of the pitiful Yin Bingyun and the words the great Wang Fei had quietly said to him that day in Prince Hiqing's manor. He couldn't help but shake his head. If Yin Bingyun truly wanted to marry the young lady of the Shun family, it would truly be a difficult matter. First, this matter needed the emperor's approval in the palace. Secondly, the young lady of the Shun family needed a suitable identity. The great Wang Fei was a good friend of the young lady of the Shun family when they were in Shangjing, so she handed this troublesome matter to Fan Xian to handle. In his life, Fan Xian was only good at breaking up marriages. He was not good at being a matchmaker. With a sorrowful sigh, he picked at the food on his plate. Wang Qinian was squatting at the side, smoking a cigarette. Seeing that Fan Xian's expression was not very good, he coughed and asked, "The taste is not to your liking?" Dabao sat by Fan Xian's side and chewed endlessly in his mouth. "Delicious." Fan Xian used the tip of his chopsticks to point at the plate and said, "Stewed fish slices made like this can rival the chefs in the brothel. Of course, the taste is excellent." The brothel he was referring to was Baiwa Brothel. Having received Fan Xian's praise, Wang Qinian smiled. The wrinkles on his face deepened. As they spoke, a 12 or 13-year-old girl carried a plate out from the inner room and obediently placed it on the table. She was too shy to bow and ran back with small, quick steps. Fan Xian looked at the girl's back and sighed. "Lao Wang, you look like an old elm tree. How did you give birth to such a lively girl?" That girl was Wang Qinian's daughter. She was also the person Fan Xian had once threatened Wang Qinian in his letters. Wang Qinian's heart jumped. He smiled bitterly and said, "Still young, still young. I can't see if she will be beautiful in the future." Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "What are you afraid of? Who would dare to forcefully take your daughter?" These words were true. Although Wang Qinian had insisted on not taking the position of head of the 8 bureaus, most people in Jingdou knew that he was Fan Xian's closest confidant. With this layer of relationship present, regardless of whether it was the 6 ministries, 3 departments, or 3 departments, no one dared to underestimate him or offend him. Dabao suddenly beamed with joy. This girl is beautiful. It was now Fan Xian's turn to be shocked. He wondered to himself what would happen if his brother-in-law suddenly fell in love and insisted on marrying Lao Wang's daughter. Of course, he wouldn't agree, but how could he appease this person's emotions? Fortunately, Dabao's temperament was still that of a 6 or 7-year-old child, so it was impossible for him to think of such things. He just stared blankly with his chopsticks in his hand, and the oil and water in his mouth slid down, but he didn't even notice. No one knew what he was thinking. Fan Xian picked up the wet towel beside him and helped Dabao wipe away the grease at the side of his lips. He asked curiously, "What are you thinking about?" Dabao tilted his head slightly. The smile on his face gradually froze, revealing a trace of grievance and sadness that was rarely seen on his face. He stammered, "Bao likes the beautiful Guliang." Fan Xian's heart darkened, and the hand holding the towel froze. He didn't know what to comfort. Wang Qinian, who was listening at the side, was a little curious. He knocked his pipe on the stone grinder beside his feet and asked, "Young uncle, who is Bao?" "Second Bao is my younger brother. He's very smart." A proud smile bloomed on Dabao's face, but this smile immediately turned into the sadness of a child. "But he's dead." Wang Qinian and Fan Xian stood in the corner of the courtyard, each pulling out their tobacco pipes. Green smoke curled up, and the stench of leaves was suffocating. Wang Qinian turned his head to glance at Linda Bao, who was playing with his little girl. Lowering his voice, he asked, "So, second Bao is young Master Lin Gong. Lin Gong was killed by the people of Dongyi 2 years ago, but I heard that the manor has been hiding it from young Master Bao. How'd he know?" Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of bitter saliva. After a moment of silence, he said, "I told him, although he's stupid, I've always treated him like a normal person. He and the Lin brothers were very close. I didn't feel comfortable hiding this matter from him. There won't be any problems, will there?" Wang Qinian asked carefully. "What problems could there be? I told him 2 years ago." Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together and faintly said, "Da Bao's intelligence is not fully developed. He is like a child who can't grow up, but it doesn't mean he doesn't know anything. There's a husband gazing rock over at Nanzhao. I don't want another brother Bao at my side." After saying this, he glanced at Da Bao and found that he was crouching by the Wang family's girl, digging earthworms. His gaze softened, and there was a tinge of pity and apologetic look in his eyes. Suddenly, someone knocked on the wooden door of the Wang family courtyard. The person knocked very hard and hurriedly. No one knew what had happened. Fan Xian and Wang Qinian met each other's eyes and furrowed their brows. Wang Qinian had just stepped forward to open the door when a man rushed in. Rushing in front of Fan Xian, he said in a loud voice, "Congratulations, sir." Fan Xian jumped in fright at this person. Focusing his eyes, he saw it was Teng Zijing. He couldn't help but curse. "What's the matter? Didn't I tell you to go back to the country estate to read books in preparation for the martial exams in the spring? Why did you run back to the capital?" He had wholeheartedly wanted Teng Zijing to be able to embark on an official career. It could be said that he had not let down Teng Zijing's attentive service and crippled leg after he had picked him up from Danzhou. However, Teng Zijing's personality was very similar to Wang Qinian's. Although he loved officialdom, he loved the life at Fan Xian's side even more. Additionally, he couldn't get into those military books. Thus, after reading for 3 days in the country estate, he had run back. Teng Zijing's expression was full of shame, but he immediately thought of the important matter. Very happily, he said, "Young master, quickly go back to the manor. The old master is already back. The whole family is waiting for you." "What exactly happened?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He went over to hold the Bao's hand and prepared to leave for the carriage. Teng Zijing followed behind him and said with a smile, "Mistress Liu is pregnant." Fan Xian paused and stood where he was. Turning around, he rubbed his head and said, "What? Am I going to have another brother? Father is indeed extraordinary." Teng Zijing paused and only understood what he meant a moment later. He hurriedly explained, "It's not madam. Mistress Liu is pregnant." Fan Xian still didn't understand what he meant. Sitting in the carriage, he tied up the Bao's clothes. Turning his head, he said angrily, "Speak clearly. Even if the Duke's manor has a child, there is no need to be so nervous." Teng Zijing couldn't resist laughing and said, "It's not the Duke's manor, it's our own manor. Cece is pregnant." Fan Xian paused. Only now did he understand. Although he had long taken Cece into the manor, in the depths of his heart, he still saw her as a younger sister. He truly did not have any precise thoughts of her as a concubine. Coincidentally, Cece had been raised by the old Danzhou manor since she was young. She never had a surname. Later, when she entered the capital, Cija's mother, Lady Liu, took good care of Cece because of similar circumstances. In the end, she simply had Cece take the surname Liu. Mistress Liu, Mistress Liu, so he was talking about Cece. No wonder Fan Xian couldn't react in time. "Cece is pregnant." Fan Xian chuckled. "Then I have to hurry back to the manor to see." Women who are pregnant for the first time always have bad tempers, particularly a shrewish girl like her. "If I'm late, I'm afraid I'll end up with a lot of complaints." The carriage trotted along the street out of the west side of the city and headed toward the south side of the city where the Fan Manor was. Suddenly, a muffled sound came from the carriage. It was as if someone had jumped up and stupidly had his head come into intimate contact with the hard carriage. A terrifyingly loud voice came from the carriage. The voice was filled with shock and terror. Half the pedestrians on the street could hear it clearly. Cece is pregnant. I'm going to be a father? Fan Xian, who had been reborn into the world of the Qing kingdom and whose mental age should be in his 30s, was finally going to be a father. The passing on of living things was always the second most powerful need one could instinctively control. Logically speaking, Fan Xian, who was sufficiently mature, should have shown a kind of controllable and sincere joy when faced with such a joyous event. However, there was clearly something wrong with his performance. He was very excited, uncontrollably excited. At the same time, other than joy, he was very afraid. Sitting by Cece's bed, Fan Xian looked like an idiot at the girl who was 2 years older than him. Cece's face was slightly pale. It looked like she was beginning to feel nervous after knowing that a life had suddenly appeared in her belly. Fan Xian looked at her dumbly and said, "How did you get pregnant?" One sat at the head of the bed and fed Cece something. Her face was filled with joy. She had always wanted to give Fan Xian a child, but she had never succeeded. Now that Cece was pregnant, thinking that Fan Xian would have descendants, she, as a housewife, also became happy. If this was a normal family, perhaps a wife without descendants would feel some jealousy toward a concubine. However, the difference in status between her and Cece's was too great. It was unavoidably foolish to feel jealousy like this. She listened to Fan Xian's strange question and couldn't help but furrow her brows slightly. Scolding, she said, "What are you saying?" Chapter 488. Wanner took the bowl and left the room. Fan Xian looked at Cece lying at the head of the bed and warmly said, "Rest well." Usually, Cece slept in the outer room of the master's bedroom in the back of the manor. However, the doctor had suddenly seen that she was pregnant. Lady Lu had made the decision to clear out a few comfortable rooms for her to move in. Fan Xian turned his head to look at the furnishings in a room and felt secretly grateful to Lady Lu. He then looked at Cece's slightly pale and sallow face and felt slightly apologetic. In a quiet voice, he said, "It was my fault to be the last person to know." As the head of the family, Fan Xian should show a warm side and a happy side. He should say some nice things to calm the pregnant woman. However, he had only said a few words before he choked. He looked stupidly at Cece's face and couldn't speak for a moment. After a moment of silence, Cece's eyes reddened slightly. She bit her lip and said, "Young master, I can see that you're not happy." "How so?" Fan Xian jumped in fright and forced a smile. It was too sudden. I wasn't mentally prepared at all. He held the girl's hand and slowly squeezed it. Smiling slightly, he said, "In my heart, you are still that girl who has always stood by my side grinding ink and adding incense. I always feel that it hasn't been long since we left Danzhou, yet you are about to become the mother of child. We've already left Danzhou for 3 years, my muddle-headed young master." Cece's tears turned into a smile. She half leaned on the bed and gazed at him with a gentle gaze. Regardless of whether it was when they lived together in Jiangnan or after formally entering the family in Danzhou, she still habitually called Fan Xian young master and had not changed it. "Even if I become an old man, I'm still not mentally prepared." Fan Xian patted her hand tenderly. "Being a father is indeed a bit scary. Young master knows everything. Besides, giving birth is a woman's business." "Knows everything? Giving birth is a woman's business, but teaching a child is a man's business. Raising a child into an adult is much more difficult than writing poetry and killing people." Fan Xian laughed at himself. He reached his hand into the blankets and carefully stroked Cece's slightly bulging belly. He couldn't help but blame himself. "Earlier, Father said it's already been 4 months. Why didn't you tell me? Even if you were shy, you should have told the mistress." Cece felt the palm moving on her abdomen, and her cheeks reddened. She pulled the blanket up to her neck and said with slight fear, I'm afraid it's fake. How can it be real or fake when I'm pregnant?" Fan Xian closed his eyes and felt the rise and fall under his palm. A complicated emotion rose in his heart. There was joy, fear, and a slight sourness. Was that his child in her belly? He really couldn't accept the fact that he was going to be a father for a while. That kind of fear actually overwhelmed the joy. Fortunately, his mind was clear at this time, and he could still show it in front of Cece. Otherwise, Cece, who was a new mother, would definitely hate him. Fancien scratched his head with a slight headache. What should I do now? Cece couldn't resist laughing out loud. Young master, of course. You should eat and sleep when you should. I can't have you watch over me every day just because I'm pregnant. Fancien suddenly stretched out his hand and gently pulled Cece's wrist over. Placing his finger on it, he closed his eyes and tilted his head to listen closely to the pulse. Warner happened to walk in. Seeing her husband taking Cece's pulse, she opened her large eyes and asked curiously, "Is it a man or a woman?" Fancien slowly moved his finger away and said with a smile, "How could it be so easy to tell? Do you think my finger is an ultrasound?" Must? Warner and Cece heard this new word and furrowed their brows at the same time, unable to understand. Fancien coughed and reminded Cece of the things she had to pay attention to, particularly not to catch a cold. He then walked to the door and called for the wife of the Tang family. He gave some detailed instructions. Of course, he had to find healthy servants and women. As for the food, he didn't just blindly eat large amounts of fish and meat. He only picked out a few nutritious dishes. Is there goat milk in the manor? The wife of the Tang family nodded excitedly. Cece was pregnant with the first grandchild of the Fan family, so the servants couldn't help but be excited. Receiving a positive answer, Fancien said, "1 bowl a day. It has to be boiled." Inside the room, Cece nestled against Wan'er's side and said unhappily, "I don't like to drink goat milk." Linwar thought about it. When she was being treated for her lung disease, she had also been forced to drink goat milk by Fancien every day. The smell was truly unbearable. She couldn't resist smiling toward the door and saying, "Is this goat milk an immortal pill?" Fancien turned his head and smiled. Although it is not an immortal pill, it is indeed good stuff. However, the smell is a bit strong. Cece, you have to endure it and keep drinking it. Lin Warner suddenly thought of the method Siki had thought of at the time and happily said, "Let Siki do this." I don't know if she put almonds or jasmine tea in it. There's a faint, astringent taste, but it takes away all the smell. Hearing that Siki was going to serve her food and drink, Cece, who was lying on the bed, felt uneasy. She was originally a serving girl with the same status as Siki. Now that she was pregnant, her treatment had suddenly increased so much. She truly didn't dare to accept it. She was afraid that everyone in the manor would gossip about her, so she unconsciously wanted to open her mouth to refuse. Fancien waved his hand and said, "There isn't that much empty courtesy in the back manor. When you were a serving girl, I still had to massage your back. I'll let Siki work a bit harder. I just don't know if this method will work." Cece's face reddened. She found that with a flash outside the door, Siki's proud face had appeared. The girl smiled and said, "Of course, this method will work. At that time, I was the one who made the ladies goat milk every day. You just had to use gauze to filter out the tea dregs." Warner smiled and glared at her. "Look at how proud you are." Cece insisted on calling Fancien young master, and Siki insisted on calling him Lady One. In this house, there was a master and mistress, as well as 2 serving girls. The way they addressed each other was strange. Perhaps only a man like Fancien, who had the experience of his previous life, would not care about the so-called status. Fortunately, these 3 girls could all cooperate with his footsteps. This was a good thing. Usually you have to bask in the sun more. Don't believe the nonsense of those midwives. If you don't get some air, you'll suffocate to death in the room. Fancien suddenly thought of something and spoke very seriously to the Tang family's wife and Warner. He knew that if Lady Lu suddenly became old, only these 2 people would be able to speak up for Cece. "Papa." The Tang family's wife quickly spat and said, "Today is a joyous occasion. How can you say that word?" Fancien couldn't be bothered with her and said to himself, "Vegetables and fruits have to be guaranteed. This cannot be missing." He turned his head and said to Cece, "When you can't eat, you still have to eat some snacks." Have the girls go make them. All right, all right. The Tung family's wife was thick-skinned. Minding her own business, she covered Fan Xian's mouth and said, "In the end, you are the first. In the future, you will have hundreds of children and thousands of grandchildren. If the young master is always so nervous and long-winded, he will torment us servants to death." Fan Xian comforted Cece with a few more words and told her a few jokes to relax her nervous state of mind. He then took Wan Er's little hand and left the room. The two of them wandered around the back garden. Along the way, they saw a few capable servants of the manor rushing over. When they saw them, they quickly bowed respectfully. However, a glimmer of awkwardness occasionally appeared in their expressions. What are they going to do? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Wan Er smiled and said, "They are all going to congratulate Cece. See me, of course, they will feel awkward." Awkward about what? Fan Xian was not stupid to this extent. He was just worried that Wan Er truly had a knot in her heart, so he purposely asked. Wan Er glared at him and leaned her head on his shoulder. In a quiet voice, she said, "What do you think?" Fan Xian patted her chubby cheek and asked with a slight smile, "Then, are you really happy or just pretending to be happy?" Wan Er's childish face still had the calmness of a housewife. She still said the same 3 words, "What do you think? Am I really that nervous?" Fan Xian held Wan Er's hand and walked to a stone bench by the side of a fake mountain to sit down. He held Wan Er on his lap. It was quiet here. There were no servants passing by. Wan Er was slightly embarrassed, so she let him be. "You're not careful enough to freeze yourself," Wan Er grumbled. Wan Er grumbled. She suddenly remembered what he had asked her. After thinking for a while, she raised her head and looked at him with her watery eyes. After a while, she said seriously, "That is what I wanted to ask you. Why you look so unhappy? And you seem nervous and afraid. What are you worried about? Are you really worried about my feelings? You should know that I am not that kind of person." Fan Xian shook his head and smiled as he tightened his arms around her. After thinking for a moment, he said, "I also don't know. Perhaps I really am not mentally prepared to be a father. What do I need to prepare?" Wan had long gotten used to her husband's habits of thinking that were not very similar to the men of this world. For example, can I create a good environment for the next generation to grow up in? Wan smiled slightly and said, "Let's not think too far ahead right now. What I'm more curious about is whether the child in Cece's stomach is a boy or a girl. Didn't we say earlier, yes, you don't have a certain chance of success. The use of a certain chance of success is very clever. Then, do you like a boy or a girl?" "A girl," Fan Xian said decisively. Lin Wan looked at him with some confusion. A moment later, she seemed to understand something. She sighed and said, "No wonder you weren't so happy after knowing you had a child. Presumably, you feel that Cece is no longer a girl." Fan Xian was confused and asked in a daze, "Why do you think so? Girls are pearls. Once they have children, they will gradually grow old and become the eyeballs of a fish. You like pearls. Even if you don't play with them, you can look at them." Lin Wan smiled merrily. "This is something you once wrote yourself. Don't deny it." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. This was Grandmaster Chao's view. Although it was similar to his own, this was not the true reason why he was still unable to feel joy when he learned he would have children. "Even if I have to become the eyeballs of a fish, I still want to have children for you." Lin Wan stared at him in a daze and gently bit her lower lip. She spoke gently but forcefully. Fan Xian smiled and nodded. Suddenly, his expression became serious. "I know there are some rather strange rules in this world. For example, children born to concubines have to call the main wife their mother. There are even those who were raised by the main wife and rarely get to see their own mother." Linwar looked at him and furrowed her brows slightly. She vaguely guessed what he was going to say. "Although all the large families in the world are like this," Fan Xian looked at her seriously, "we don't want to be like this." It was not a request or a demand. It was a notice that could not be refused. It was no. Fan Xian originally didn't want to say such serious words at a time like this and disturb Wan Er's already difficult to suppress sour feelings. In his previous life, when he was watching the door of a large manor, He had been frightened badly by Sister Gao Wa's role as the bastard of a middle-aged fish. Lin Wanner nodded. A glimmer of sadness flashed through her eyes. Slowly, she said, "I understand what you mean. Don't be sad." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then smiled and said, "You've seen all the improvements I've made to the medicine during this half a year in Hangzhou. Most importantly, tomorrow, Sir Fei is coming. Since he dares to come see us, naturally, he has something good to give us." The delicate body in his arms suddenly shook. Lin Wanner looked at his eyes in disbelief and said with pleasant surprise, "It's true." Although this news made her happy, Fan Xian knew that his merciless words had still hurt her heart. However, for the sake of Cece and the child in her womb, he had to say it first. He sighed gently. First, there was indeed something stifling in his heart that needed to be released. Second, in his previous life, Sir Jean had once used this trick on Xiao Bao in The Deer and the Cauldron. It had never failed against girls. As expected, Wanner saw his serious expression and immediately pushed aside the small hidden bitterness in her heart. She asked with concern, "What is it?" "Earlier, you also saw that after learning of Cece's pregnancy, I wasn't very happy. On the contrary, I was a bit scared." Fan Xian lowered his head as if he wanted to find support and comfort in his heart from his wife's breathing. Actually, there are a few reasons. The first reason was that he was worried that Wanner would be sad from touching this scene. This reason had been lightly mentioned earlier. As for the second reason, it was actually very simple. "I'm a person without a father," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "Although I have a father, or even two fathers, when I was in Danzhou, I didn't have either. Furthermore, the real one seems to have never been my father." It was a difficult sentence to pronounce, but Wanner understood it. She glanced around cautiously to make sure that no one else would hear these words. "Father treats me very well, but you understand, in the end, this is not the same thing. As for the one in the palace, ever since Danzhou came to Jingdou, I've seen through him. Even your crown prince and second prince are driven around like donkeys, much less an illegitimate child like me. I am a person without a father," Fan Xian repeated with emphasis. "That is why I am very afraid that I won't be a father. That is why my first reaction earlier was fear and unease." In his previous life, Fan Xian didn't have parents. In this life, he also didn't have parents. Even worse, in his previous life, it was the heavens that were terrible. In this life, it was his parents that were terrible. In the depths of his heart, he had always thought that when it came to educating his children, his mother did a terrible job. It made him very sad. In both of his lives, he had been lacking in this area. It had cast a great shadow on his heart. Perhaps he hadn't noticed it in the past, but now, the good news from the Fan Manor completely revealed his dark side. He unconsciously refused to admit that he wanted to be a father. Lin Wanner looked at him with a face full of pity. "My mother also doesn't love me," Fan Xian said woodenly. "Perhaps you don't believe it, but she really doesn't love me. Unable to love or not love." The world always thought that Yi Qingmei was Fan Xian's mother, but only he knew that after being reborn into this world, he only had curiosity and an indescribable feeling for that distant woman. But as he gradually grew up, the people around him constantly talked about that once dazzling woman, and the things around him constantly talked about that woman's past. The marks around him constantly reminded Fan Xian of that woman's existence. Over time, Fan Xian, who had never received a mother's love in his previous life, finally got used to this. He began to gradually accept that his mother was Yi Qingmei, and he began to feel attached to that name. Perhaps because of the strongest bond between mother and son, the two lonely souls of the transmigrator were connected. He admitted this, and in that cave in the western mountains of northern Qi, in front of Shaoan, he personally said these words. But after reading the letter in the box, Fan Xian, who knew many of the stories of the past, had to tell himself that Yi Qingmei did not love him. It was not referring to this soul from another world, but rather, she did not have much love for this son of flesh. He had inherited Yi Qingmei's Qingyu Hall of the Overwatch Council's palace treasury, the connections of the past, and close comrades but she did not purposely leave these things to him. And even if she did leave them to him, so what? My mother doesn't love me, Fan Xian said calmly. Otherwise, she wouldn't have abandoned me and left on her own. Lin wanted to comfort the somewhat absent-minded Fan Xian, but she didn't know where to start. She, who had grown up in the palace, knew very well what a dazzling figure her mother-in-law was. It's not just because of this. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he thought. When the box was opened, he was a bit disappointed because the letter was left for Uncle Wu Zhu and not for him. The contents of the letter, in particular, made him even more disappointed. She called me a bastard son, he said with a smile. And she didn't leave me a single word. She just left. This kind of indifference, this kind of calmness, appears to be so calm as to be absurd. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought of his romantic past. He always felt that perhaps his birth had always been an absurd matter. He continued to speak, but Wanner felt a chill in her heart as she listened. She didn't tell me how to survive in such a dangerous world. She didn't tell me who was worthy of trust. She didn't tell me how I should eat my food or how I should love my wife. Fan Xian smiled. She had great love for the people of the world, yet she didn't pay much attention to her own children. Isn't this very shameful? Perhaps only such a shameful mother would give birth to such a shameful son like me. After saying this, Fan Xian coughed gently. Lin Wan'er came down from his legs and pounded his back. Fan Xian waved his hand and smiled. That was close. Fortunately, there was still father. He pointed in the direction of the front yard and said, "There is also grandmother and those two strange old men. Otherwise, I don't know what would have happened to me in this life." Fan Xian had always been a very self-restrained and cautious person. He didn't have much time to be emotional like he was today. Lin Wan had been unable to get a word in. Seeing that he was gradually moving away from only sighing, she simply smiled and looked at him, listening to his inner monologue. "Listen to me sing a song," Fan Xian suddenly said very seriously. Lin Wan nodded. She was a bit curious. What kind of song would a grown man sing? Fan Xian opened his lips and began to sing. His clear voice carried a bit of sadness. His voice was not good, but this song was particularly sad. In the sadness, there was also a bit of hope. It was like a child propping up his chin under the eaves after the rain, waiting for his mother's return. It was like a little figure of white cloth under the eaves being battered by the wind and rain, fluttering in the wind and rain. It was completely powerless, only held by that string. It was indescribably sad, yet it gazed into the distance. The song ended. What does that mean? Fan Xian was singing a language Lin Wan had never heard of. The pronunciation of the words was a bit strange. The general meaning of the lyrics is very simple. It's probably, "Mother, how are you? Yesterday, I was on the branches of a fir tree. I saw a bright star. The star gazed at me just like Mother, very gentle. I said to the star, I must be able to withstand setbacks. Are you a boy? If you feel lonely, I will come and talk maybe one day. Then so be it. Looking forward to your reply, Mother. One wristone rest, Mother. How are you?" The kitten in the temple yesterday was taken away by the people of the nearby village. The kitten cried tightly hugged the mother cat. I said, "Don't cry, you. I won't be lonely. Are you a boy? You will see Mother again one day. Certainly, then so be it. Looking forward to your reply, Mother. One wristone rest." Fan Xian smiled and looked at Wan whose eyes were already red. "It sounds good, doesn't it?" "Yes." Wan snorted and asked, "Is Isho the child who wrote the letter? How pitiful." "Yes, a very smart child who can't live with his mother," said Li Yindong. Fan Xian smiled and said, "He's very similar to me, except that he can write a letter and mail it to an address. But if I write a letter, where can I send it? What's the name of this song?" "Mother." In the quiet bedroom, Fan Xian took out a key and gently opened the outermost layer of the long black chest. Then he used a steady finger to press it a few times. Suddenly, he began to miss Wu Zhu. Slowly, he took out the metal instrument and the thin letter. Fan Xian didn't look at it, because he was already too familiar with the contents of the letter. He only stared at the third layer of paper, the piece of paper that looked like it could be blown away by the wind at any moment. On the paper was Yi Qingmei's straight handwriting. Hey, if it's Wu Zhu, tell me honestly, who are you? Just like that rainy night, Fan Xian's lips moved slightly. I'm your son. How did you open this chest? If it's not my daughter, then it's my son. You can look at what's below when you kill someone. Remember, he opened the third layer and took out the item from inside. Glancing at the words on it, he couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He said to himself, it really is an abortion drug. I say, Mother, can't you be more creative with your pranks? He was silent in the room for a long time. Then, he raised his head and, with a confident smile, said seriously to the chest, Mother, I've killed someone, but I won't use this thing. You're always used to treating everything as a joke, so in the end, you left me very laughably. But I'm different. I will work hard to survive in this world. As for my daughter or son, please believe me, I will take good care of them. At least, I will do better than you. Let me say this first. I sympathize with Wan'er. In the future, things will get better. Believe me, some people guessed that they were going to open the third layer. At first, most people guessed that it was Durex and the emergency contraceptive pill. I can only say that everyone's imagination has surpassed my or Xiao Yezi's talent for pranks. I am very impressed. Today's chapter has so many words because I have always wanted to write a paragraph. What should I write? It's not Fan Xian's psychological shadow, but rather his feelings for Yi Qingmei. It's the kind of hidden bitterness that should arise when one is truly recognized as a son. Mother doesn't love me. I've put this note in the draft for over half a year. I've always wanted to write it. Today, I finally wrote it. Very good. That song is my favorite song. It's the ending song of Ishio. It's by Fujita Shuko's mother. It can be searched on Baidu. Those who haven't heard it should listen to it. It's really good. This is also why I've always said that Fan Xian must sing it in the draft. The abortion pill was Yi Qingmei's original weapon, but Fan Xian's existence proved that she had never used it. Then, she treated it as her most important inheritance in this world and passed it on to her descendants. It was more important than the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury. From this, it can be seen that she loved her bastard of a son. Fan Xian must clearly understand this. These words and the song were not in the word count. The monthly votes were still in double. Although the second son's voice was not pleasant to hear, he was very handsome. He was indescribably happy. He asked everyone to continue to support him. He was very grateful. Chapter 489. For yesterday's chapter, I debated with the leader for over an hour. I'm so pitiful. I'm not Fan Xian, so how can I be innocent? The monthly votes went to third place. My peers behind me chased after me closely, saying seriously, I want to see if I can get into the top 3 this month. My votes will double in the next 7 days, so I'm constantly canvassing for votes. Brothers and sisters, if you have any on hand, just give them to me. The news of the Fan Manor having a joyous occasion was like it had grown a pair of wings and immediately flew out. It flew past the tall walls of the manors of the nobles and the vigilant eyes of the waiters in the tea houses. It became news that everyone knew. The hot topic of discussion among the nobles in Jingdo and the greatest joy of the common people after their meals were all gathered here. This news also flew into the royal palace and entered the ears of the emperor and empress dowager, completely disregarding the obstruction of the majestic palace walls. According to eunuch Yao, the moment the Qing emperor heard of this news, he gently stroked his beard and was very pleased. That night, he went to the little tower again. After the empress dowager learned of this news, she quickly went to the back of Hongguang Palace to worship. Her fingers endlessly stroked the string of rosary beads with a face full of smiles. Speaking of which, it was strange. Including Fan Xian, the Qing emperor had 5 princes. The third prince was still young, but the great prince was not young. He had been married for a long time, but he still did not have children. The second prince and the crown prince were the same. No matter how one looked at it, the child in Cece's stomach in the Fan Manor was the first of the 3rd generation of the royal family. It was impossible for the nobles in the royal palace to be happy. However, the Empress Dowager faintly felt some regret. If only the pregnant woman was Chun Girl. Putting aside whether or not she was a princess, Fan Xian's official wife was, after all, her favorite granddaughter. Given Fan Xian's present power and status, countless guests surged forth with gifts and congratulations. In the next few days, there was an endless stream of carriages in front of the Fan Manor in the south of the city. Officials from all walks of life came and went endlessly. Tung Zijing and his wife's legs were about to turn to jelly from running. Other than a few important figures, such as the people from King Jing's manor, who Fan Xian personally came out to greet, the other guests were all single-handedly blocked by the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. Fortunately, these guests only gave him valuable gifts and did not disturb him for too long. The people in court and palace were actually calculating in their hearts. Although Fan Xian having a child was a major event, the one pregnant was his concubine. If they appeared overly enthusiastic at this time, who knew what the princess in the manor was thinking? Pleasing one side, but offending the other was not a good deal. Furthermore, these officials did not know just how happy the palace was. 3 days later, the joy in the palace was displayed in front of the Qing officials and people in 2 ways. First, it was the embroidered newspaper organized by the internal court that used red to report the good news to the people of the world. The internal court newspaper always told the jokes of jealousy between officials and the funny side of history. Although the story of Chun Pingping's first love was a bit boring and uninteresting, it was very eye-catching. However, ever since Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, he had made council affairs more open through rectification. He ordered the 8th Bureau to put up countless notices on the door of the 1st Bureau, turning the sinister process of official strife into a collection of stories about solving cases. Regardless of whether it was in a previous or current life, stories with pillows and fists always sold best. The internal court newspaper only had pillows and no fists, so all the glory was stolen by the notice board on the door of the 1st Bureau. Fortunately, Fan Xian had a son. The emperor silently allowed the internal court newspaper to publicize the matter. It wrote the story of Fan Xian coming from Danzhou to Jingdou in detail into a long, erotic story. It vaguely mentioned the princess, the saint girl of northern Qi, the past of the young mother of the Fan Manor, the night of poetry in the palace, and the past of Jiangnan. This was a summary of Fan Xian's rushed 20 years of life. It was very glorious. Once the newspaper came out, paper became expensive in Jingdou. The young ladies of each manor begged the elders of their families to spend a lot of money to buy a copy to put in their boudoir as a memento. At the same time, they prayed in their hearts that the faintly discernible temple would bestow upon them a man like Sir Fan Jr. The internal court newspaper finally used this opportunity to successfully conquer the Jingdou people in front of the notice board in the 1st Bureau. The second reaction of the palace's joy was rewards. No one knew whether it was the emperor's or the empress dowager's intentions, but the rewards from the palace flowed into the Fan Manor like water. Although the one with the child was Cici, from Fan Jian to Lady Lu to the young lady of the Fan family who was far away studying in northern Qi, they all received great rewards. Fan Xian's official wife, Lin Wanner, received the greatest reward of all. Silks and satins, gold, stone, jade, food, and toys were all lined up densely in the manor. It made the wife of the Tung family so busy that she became absent-minded. She thought to herself that the young master had saved the emperor's life once, but it was not as great as the reward he received this time. Cici received a reward and was given a certain title. In any case, Fan Xian didn't understand this title. Even the unborn child in her stomach was given a title first. The newspaper and the rewards, one after another, made the joy of the people in the royal palace spread to every inch of Jingdou. The officials who had given gifts beforehand relaxed. Only Fan Xian was not very happy. He looked at the list of gifts eunuch Yao had brought and shook his head. A complicated emotion rose in his heart. To his father beside him, he said, "What are the people in the palace thinking? What does my child have to do with them?" "These are words said in a fit of pique," Fan Jian said with a smile. "I thought you would mature a bit." Who would have thought that you would say such words in a fit of pique? What does it matter? What do you think it matters? In the third generation, this is the first. The Empress Dowager has been anxious for many years. Finally, she can hold a great-grandchild. In her happiness, the rewards she gives exceed the norm. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "Hold a great-grandchild? Tomorrow, I'll send Cece back to Danzhou. Born in Danzhou, raised in Danzhou, and let grandmother play with her." This was still in a fit of pique. Cece was pregnant. How could she travel thousands of li? Fan Xian laughed loudly, but couldn't be bothered to scold him. Ever since he learned of Cece's pregnancy 4 days ago, this usually serious and upright minister of revenue could not hide his true nature. From his face to his bones, a sense of pride and happiness seeped through him. In this world, there were not many people who could fight the emperor for a son and win. Furthermore, this son was about to give him a grandson. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel comforted and strangely proud. When you return to the palace tomorrow to give thanks, don't forget. Fan Xian took a sip of tea and glanced at his son. He found that it was clear that his son had not heard these words. Speaking of which, why has the crown prince never had a crown princess? Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and furrowed his brows. Even if it's in order, the great prince and second prince are both married. A year has passed. Is the palace not anxious about the crown prince's matter? His words were asked naturally and cleverly concealed the probing in his words. Fan Xian was clearly so happy that he didn't realize his son was probing him. He furrowed his brows and said, "As early as 3 years ago, the Empress Dowager was already anxiously planning the matter of the crown princess. The Empress was choosing people from various manors in Jingdo, and even picked our manor." Fan Xian shivered. He thought to himself that if his sister had truly become the crown princess, that would have been terrible. It was not that his sister would have been terrible, but he would have been terrible. Wouldn't he have immediately fallen to the crown prince's side and planned the matter of fighting for the throne with his brother? Fortunately, this matter did not happen. Fan Xian continued. However, for some reason, the crown prince never agreed. This can be considered a strange matter from back then. You know the crown prince. In his early years, he was rather preposterous. He liked to hang out in the entertainment houses and brothels. He was originally a person with great interest in the matters between men and women, yet he refused to marry. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said, "But the crown prince's marriage is not something he can refuse just because he doesn't want it. This shows how smart the crown prince is." Fan Jian smiled and said, "To convince the Empress Dowager and Empress, the crown prince had thought a lot. First, he said that the great prince and the second prince were not married yet. The Qing kingdom governed the world with filial piety and paid particular attention to brotherly respect. As a younger brother, how could he rush to get married before his 2 brothers? At that time, the great prince was still fighting the Hu people in the West. It was impossible for him to arrange a marriage in such a short time. Although the reason is sufficient, it's not convincing." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "After all this, it turns out I'm the representative of those who marry early. It's natural to be the first to have a child. It's the same logic, but when it comes to the emperor's family matters, it naturally needs to be said by the mouth of a persuasive person." Fan Jian smiled. The crown prince invited the grand tutor of the crown prince, Shu the grand secretary. Shu the grand secretary was a stubborn man and deeply believed that what the crown prince said was reasonable. Not only did he personally ask the emperor to postpone the crown prince's marriage, he even wrote to the north to ask Master Zhuang to speak. Fan Xian laughed. So Mr. Zhuang Mohan also did something like this in the past. Fan Jian suddenly saw the tiredness in his son's eyes. He sighed and said, "Did you not sleep well these past few days? Quickly go rest." Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and took his leave of the study. He had indeed not rested well these past few days. First of all, Cece was pregnant, so he had to be by her side at all times to comfort and be considerate. On the other side, although Warner did not appear to have anything on the surface and was still happily managing Cece's little life, everyone knew that a girl's mood must be full of mixed emotions. Fan C felt great heartache and had to take out a lot of time to accompany and comfort her. He had to take care of both sides, so he didn't have much time to rest. In the corridor in front of the study, he stretched and yawned. He shook his head in distress. He suddenly thought of the truth of life he had once thought of a long time ago in the garden of his manor. For a man, marrying too early was always a stupid move. However, the Crown Prince's insistence on not marrying early was probably based on a very stupid idea. Fan Xian yawned and sighed in his heart. He couldn't tell that the Crown Prince was a lover. What an ill-fated relationship. Suddenly, he saw Lady Lu walk in with a warm smile and an old man. Fan Xian's gaping mouth couldn't close for a moment. He jumped up and yelled loudly, "You're finally here." The person who had come was not a guest. It was the teacher Fan Xian greatly respected, trusted, and loved, Fei Ti. However, teacher and student met for the first time in almost a year. Between the old and the young, there was hidden wind and thunder raging. The light of knives and the will of swords exploded. It was as if they could throw out a handful of poison for the other to taste at any moment. Lady Lu was an intelligent person. Although she didn't understand the reason, she could see that this was not a place to stay for long. She casually said a few words and then left. She didn't even inform Minister Fan of the important news of Fei Jie's arrival. "Sir," Fan Xian looked at the strange color in Fei Jie's eyes with a not-quite-there smile and said, "You've been hiding from me for so many days. Why have you come today?" Fei Jie glanced at him unhappily and shook his head. "Don't think of anything good. I've tried the medicine and prescription you sent over many times. I don't think there's any problem at all. Basically, it's very difficult." Fan Xian shook his head in distress. He had thought that since Fei Jie was willing to come to the manor, he must have solved this problem. He didn't expect to hear an answer that wasn't so wonderful. All along, he hadn't cared too much about the problem of whether or not Wanner could have children. He didn't even consider whether or not he would have descendants. On the cliff in Danzhou, he told Uncle Wu Zhu that one of his 3 goals was to have children wildly. But Wanner didn't think like this. She wanted a child too much, so Fan Xian could only become forced to be nervous. Teacher and student sat in a quiet corner of the garden in the back of the manor. A servant brought them tea and then retreated. When cousins marry, will it have any effect on descendants? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then asked a question he hadn't asked in a long time. Fei Jie glanced at him and said in a raspy voice, "Do you think your luck will be that bad?" Fan Xian smiled and thought to himself that it was right. It was just a question of probability. Without question, he was the luckiest person in the world. Will it be more difficult to have children? Fan Xian suddenly furrowed his brows and asked, "Who said that?" Fei Jie understood that he was talking about blood relatives. Mockingly, he said, 100 years ago, the Wei Emperor raped his own daughter for a dozen years. In the end, she gave birth to 7 children in a row. Of course, not many of the 7 children were normal. Fei Jie shrugged his shoulders. Chaotic. The royal family is indeed the most chaotic place in the world, Fan Xian sighed and said. Fei Jie furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know if his disciple's words meant something. However, that matter had too many implications. In order to protect Fan Xian, he and Qin Pingping would not say anything to Fan Xian beforehand. "Why have you come today to teach me?" Fan Xian asked sincerely. Fei Jie thought for a bit and then said, "The director guessed that your home is not peaceful, so he had me come to calm your heart." "Calm?" "Yes, give me another half a year, and I might be able to solve the problem you and your wife are having headaches about." Fei Jie smiled slightly. "Then, I must remind you of something. Your return date is almost here. Don't use Cici's pregnancy as an excuse to not go to Jiangnan." Looking at the palace's attitude, Fan Xian might be kept in Jingdou because of this matter. This was what Qin Pingping and Fei Jie were truly worried about. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then nodded. He faintly sensed that Qin Pingping and Sir Fei did not want him to stay in Jingdou for too long. It seemed that they had also sensed that something big might happen in Jingdou. He finally couldn't resist. Fei Jie was his childhood teacher. In his opinion, he was the last person in the world to harm him. He hesitated for a moment and then said, "Is something going to happen in the palace?" Fei Jie smiled and said, "What could happen?" A glimmer of worry flashed through his eyes, but it was hidden from Fan Xian's eyes. He looked at Fan Xian's face, which was still as clean and untainted as it was a dozen years ago. Involuntarily, he thought of the time when he took Fan Xian to dig graves, admire corpses, and take out stomachs and intestines. His heart darkened slightly. He smiled gently and said, "In the future, when you're alone, you have to be careful. Don't be like when you were little, often tricked by others." Fan Xian was slightly startled. A strange emotion welled up in his heart. He hurriedly asked, "Sir, what do you mean by this?" Fei Jie scratched his head and paid no attention to the flying dandruff. "Nothing. It's just that I spend many years wandering in the mountains and am rarely by your side. The strange smoke ice medicine, I've never explained it to you. It was my fault." Fan Xian was very moved and quickly said, "Sir, what are you saying? Without you, I don't know how many times we would have died." Fei Jie smiled and didn't say anything more. The next day, he entered the palace to give his thanks. Although Fan Xian was unwilling, he still piled a sincere and grateful smile on his face. He walked all over the palace, particularly in front of the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. He held out his grateful heart and smeared a layer of the confusion and excitement of being a father for the first time. His performance was brilliant. Along the way, there was no more snow in the Vermilion Palace. It was quiet and elegant. Fan Xian was sitting in the Eastern Palace, looking at the Crown Prince in front of him and talking casually. He looked at the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace wearing light yellow clothing and his seemingly sincere face. Thinking of what would happen not long after, for some reason, he felt a sense of apology in his heart. The Crown Prince was urging him and his aunt, who was his mother-in-law, to ease their relationship. It could be seen that the Crown Prince was speaking sincerely. However, it was unknown whether he was considering the problem from Fan Xian's or the eldest princess's point of view. Let bygones be bygones. Just like I said to you in Baiwa Brothel, why should the matters of our elders affect our present? Chapter 490. This chapter thanks me as a Paigio. I was about to write about the Crown Prince for the last time when I saw his post in the Qing Union Club. I feel the same way. Sad. Everyone, please continue to vote for today's monthly votes. I really can't do it anymore. I have no more excuses, silently and perversely canvass votes. The greater the profit, the greater the lie, and the more outstanding the actor. Fan Xian deeply believed in this. Standing in the court, what they tested each other was the ownership of the chair. This was the greatest benefit in the world, so it would not be strange for the Crown Prince to tell such a big lie in front of him. The problem was that Fan Xian had no way of determining how true the Crown Prince's words were. If he was in the Crown Prince's position, would he make such a promise? Let bygones be bygones. Given the Crown Prince's natural position, the Empress Dowager's love, and his unknown relationship with the eldest princess, if he also had Fan Xian's support from the Overwatch Council and Palace Treasury, no one would be able to stop his ascension to the throne. If he could obtain Fan Xian's support, it seemed that the Crown Prince could make enough sacrifices. The problem was, given Fan Xian's life experience and knowledge, he did not think that this kind of transaction would happen unless the Crown Prince truly became a fatherless person. If he truly became such a person, how could Fan Xian dare to sit next to him? He chatted warmly with the Crown Prince. Occasionally, he would think of when he first entered Jingdo, the Crown Prince's good attitude toward him and those stories. The complicated clouds in his heart grew thicker. Is one all right? After walking around the royal palace for so long, only the Crown Prince was the first person to directly ask if one was all right. He asked very directly. Fan Xian smiled. His mind was slightly absent-minded. He spoke intermittently to the Crown Prince, but his gaze fell on the other party's face. Looking at it seriously, he gradually saw some details that he had never noticed before. The Crown Prince was very lonely and pitiful. As he walked out of the Eastern Palace, the sun had gradually set. The faint red light of dusk shone on the Vermilion Palace walls and gradually spread out. It covered the cold-resistant short plants and palace buildings around him in a layer of red, an inauspicious red. Fan Xian placed his hands behind his back. His expression was calm, as if he was deep in thought. His thoughts were all on the crown prince. Thinking about it now, Fan Xian realized that of the 5 princes, including himself, the most pitiful was the crown prince. He was only a little older than Fan Xian, and the Yi family had been destroyed before Fan Xian was born. What about the crown prince? For years after the destruction of the Yi family, on a night of bloodshed in Jingdo, the crown prince's maternal family was slaughtered to the last. His maternal grandfather died at his father's hands. He lost far more family than he did. From then on, the crown prince lived alone in the palace, living in anxiety and unease. The only people he could rely on were the Empress Dowager and the Empress who loved him dearly. No, the Empress did not count. Just as his father had said in the past, the reason the Emperor did not abolish the Empress and make it difficult for him to inherit the throne was because the Empress was extremely stupid. Her relatives had been completely slaughtered. This kind of situation was exactly what the Emperor needed. The only person the crown prince could rely on was the Empress Dowager. As he gradually grew up, the environment of the palace and the Empress' deep memories of the past created the crown prince's mediocre and slightly timid personality. He had no friends and could not have friends. He could only be silent. However, the Qing Emperor did not want the successor he had chosen to be silent forever, so he picked out the second prince with the intention of sharpening the crown prince's knife. In the end, he picked out Fan Xian and took down the second prince to continue to sharpen the crown prince. Such an abnormal life would naturally lead to many psychological problems. Silence and silence. Either explode in silence or become perverted in silence. The crown prince seemed to have chosen the latter. However, his heart did not seem to have an overly terrifying part. Fan Xian walked to the bottom of the palace wall and turned his head to look at the towering Taiji Palace glowing with a fiery light. He narrowed his eyes slightly and sighed in his heart. When did he want to stand against you? Comparing the crown prince and the second prince, Fan Xian actually leaned more toward the crown prince because he knew the ruthlessness under the second prince's gentle expression. He could try to knock the second prince off his horse and thus preserve his life, but he could not use the same method on the crown prince. Because the crown prince's position was too special, he would either soar into the clouds and transform into a dragon, or he would bleed under his scales and fall to the Yellow Springs. The second prince had to do something to inherit the throne, so he gave Fan Xian too many opportunities. However, the crown prince was the exact opposite. He did nothing and could not do anything. Only then would he naturally inherit the throne. Once the crown prince thought through this, he would be like what he had shown this year. He would intelligently maintain his calm and watch everything with cold eyes. However, calmness did not mean magnanimity. If Fan Xian was truly blinded by this illusion and softened his heart, once the other party actually ascended the throne, what welcomed Fan Xian would certainly be the Empress' crazed pursuit for revenge and the eldest princess' merciless purge. At that time, would the crown prince still cherish his life? However, the second prince had not been beaten back by Fan Xian. The crown prince had also charged forward. He gently clenched his fists and made his heart cold and hard. He thought to himself, "It is not easy for anyone to survive in this world. Don't blame me." He took one last look at the setting of the royal palace that seemed to be on fire and tilted his head slightly. The source of all of this was actually the middle-aged man sitting on the dragon chair. Fan Xian suddenly felt a glimmer of pleasure. He wanted to see the middle-aged man's embarrassed expression turn into rage. He wanted to break through the emperor's calm disguise and truly tear at his heart. When all was said and done, everyone was a group of cruel people. On this day, the sky was high and the clouds were light. Spring had not yet arrived, but the sky was clear. The winter trees on both sides of the road outside the Jingdo city gates spread their branches, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws to frighten the people far away from home. A row of black carriages filed out from the city gates and lined up by the side of the road. At the same time, They waited for the large group of people in front to disperse. A young man lifted the curtain and came out. Standing in front of the carriage, he put his hand on the awning and looked in that direction. He furrowed his brows slightly and said to himself, "Why is this happening?" The young man was Fan Xian. It was already February. He could not find any more excuses to stay in Jingdo. Furthermore, under these circumstances, he knew that the further he left Jingdo, the better. Only then would he not drag himself into the water. However, the matter of Cece's pregnancy gave him a headache. Later, after a good discussion in the manor, they decided to have one to stay in Jingdo to take care of her and let him go to Jiang'an alone. Today was the day he would leave Jingdo. With the precedent, he did not inform many people. Even the young scholars in the Imperial College did not receive the news. His journey this time was relatively quiet, and there was a bit more loneliness. Fan Xian looked at the Qing soldiers lining up in front of the road and furrowed his brows slightly. In a short while, a few riders broke away from the even more parting group. These riders circled back and rode toward Fan Xian's group of carriages. Hearing the sound of hooves, Fan Xian smiled slightly and got off the carriage to wait. At the very front of the riders was an officer wearing thin, cotton-lined armor. He looked very heroic. Behind him followed a few deputies. The officer rode in front of Fan Xian and dismounted with a whip. His movements were clean and efficient. When he took off the armor on his face and revealed his handsome and warm face, only then did Fan Xian realize that this person was King Jing's heir, Li Hongcheng. Who would have thought that we would leave the capital at the same time? Li Hongcheng patted Fan Xian's shoulder heavily and said with a smile. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Staying well in Jingdo, why go join the army? As a man, of course, he has to seek achievements. But it is not necessary to seek them on the battlefield. If the king had not told me, I would not have known you had such plans. The Qing kingdom conquered the world on horseback. Their people were simple and valiant. Even the children of the royal family learned horsemanship and martial arts from a young age. From the previous generation, they had the habit of joining the army. In this generation, the great prince was a model figure. He had started as a minor officer and climbed to the position of a great general. Li Hongcheng was silent for a moment. He then said, "You also know that if I stay in Jingdo, my father will always keep me locked up in the manor. That is no different from being in prison. I would rather go to the west and fight with the strange who people than suffer these grievances again." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then raised his head and slowly said, "You must take care of yourself. Otherwise, I will feel apologetic. If I can make you feel apologetic, then this expedition will not be a loss." Li Hongcheng smiled after a slight pause. In life, one has to find a few goals for oneself. This time, I joined the Western Expedition Army to fulfill a dream I had since I was young. Fan Xian said, "I didn't know you had such a dream in life." I had thought your dream in life was all on the pleasure boat. The two of them smiled at each other. They noticed that there were still many people beside them, so it was not convenient for them to talk in depth. Li Hongcheng held the reins of his horse and rode side by side with Fan Xian. They came to the slope below the official road. The leafless and withered branches were even denser here, blocking out the dim sunlight in the sky into patches of coldness. It was quiet. No one could hear the two of them talking. Li Hongcheng was silent for a moment. A relaxed smile gradually rose to his face. Happily, he said, "The matters of these 2 years have made me understand. In Jingdo, I can't win against you. The second prince also can't win against you. This is good. I'll leave Jingdo for you to play. I'll go play in the west." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. A moment later, he sincerely said, "The road to Shihu is long and difficult. You must take care. Although seeking fame in the military is a shortcut, it is also a dangerous path. Although the great prince holds military power in his hands, you know how hard it was to waste a few bitter years in the West." Li Hongcheng nodded his head thoughtfully. Seriously, he said, "Since I've joined the army, I've long been mentally prepared. Father also knows what I'm thinking. Otherwise, he wouldn't have nodded." His so-called thinking meant that he had truly decided to leave the tiresome and dangerous battles in Jingdo. However, Fan Xian remembered that the main force of the Western Expedition Army was still the Yi family, the family of the second prince's father-in-law. He couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. Looking at Li Hongqing's face, he resisted and resisted. In the end, he couldn't resist and said, "Yi Zhong is the second prince's father-in-law. Since you've decided not to participate in the affairs of Jingdo." Before he could finish his reminder, Li Hongqiang had already waved his hand to stop him from speaking. Calmly, he said, "Relax. I will do what I promised you. I'm not an idiot. It's just—" He smiled. "It's just that you appear to be a bit too smart, which makes it difficult for us to find opportunities to show our abilities. Particularly during these 2 years, you've used my father to suppress me. If I don't lower my head to you, I'm afraid I'll still be under house arrest." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "It's not that I'm using King Jing to suppress you. It's that King Jing is using me to suppress you. You have to be clear about this. It's fine no matter what." Li Hongqiang sighed. "In any case, my father and you think the same. Since it's like this, why should I forcefully struggle for anything? It's good to go to the west this time. Presumably, the blood and fire on the battlefield will be more direct." He suddenly calmed down and looked into Fan Xian's eyes. Sincerely, he said, "My relationship with the second prince has always been very good. I have something to ask of you." The word "ask" sounded a bit heavy. Fan Xian immediately guessed what he was going to say. Furrowing his brows first, he said, "I am only an official. Some things are not up to me to decide. Furthermore, who can completely predict victory and defeat? There's no need to say these things in advance." Li Hongqiang shook his head calmly. "You didn't let me say it in advance because you were afraid you wouldn't dare to promise me something. You're right when you say victory and defeat are uncertain. No matter how you look at it, it's impossible for you to defeat them in a few short years. For some reason, I feel that in the end, you will win." "I'm flattering you." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "But don't forget, he is, after all, your brother, blood brother." Li Hongqiang looked into his eyes and said seriously, "If that day really comes, I hope you can let him live. You think too highly of me." Fan Xian turned his body slightly and gazed in a certain direction to the side of Jingdo. Calmly, he said, "He is a prince. No matter how much power we, as officials, have, we cannot decide his life or death. Furthermore, you said you want me to let him live. If one day the second prince catches me, will he let me live?" His voice gradually became cold. "I've given the second prince enough time to think. You know why I've shaved off his wings this year. But he won't do it. His heart is too big, so big that he can't control it. Since it is so, if I still extravagantly control myself, then I am looking for death." Li Hongqiang slowly lowered his head and said, since he was 10, he was forced onto the path of fighting for the throne. After all these years, it has already become his unchangeable goal in life. Even if you beat him until he is the only one left, he will not be satisfied. That's the principle. Fan Xian's expression gradually became cold. He raised his right arm and pointed in a certain direction he was facing. A few dozen li from here is the Fan family's country estate. Do you know what's there? Li Hongqiang glanced at him. "There are 4 people buried there." Fan Xian lowered his arm and said. Fan Xian put down his arm. "The 4 guards of the Fan family are buried. They were with me after I entered the capital. They were killed on Yolan Street." He continued, "The attack on Yolan Street was the eldest princess's idea and the second prince's arrangement. Although you were used, you can't deny that no matter how you look at it, you are an accomplice. From that day on, I swore that in Jingdo, if anyone else wanted to kill me, I would not show any mercy to them. During these 3 years, too many people have died. Many people have died on my side, and many people have died on their side. The hatred between the 2 sides has long become blood in the mud. No matter how it is washed, it cannot be washed clean. Since the second prince thinks he can continue to drag it out with the Yi family's help, then I will drag it out with him." Fan Xian turned his head to look at Li Hongqiang and slowly said, "Since the second prince refuses to back down, then this matter has already become a situation of life and death. You wanted to show mercy to him, but have you ever thought that this is equivalent to harming my own life? Have you ever thought that the request you make of me is very unfair? Very unfair. Li Hongcheng laughed self-mockingly inside. I only hope that this matter can end peacefully. That depends on the crown prince and second prince's hearts. Fan Xian said something very similar to the emperor's. I am only the knife in the emperor's hand. For this matter to end peacefully, it depends on how these two perform in front of the emperor. He paused and suddenly felt that speaking to Hongcheng so mercilessly at this moment of separation seemed too harsh. He couldn't help but shake his head and soften his tone. You didn't have to stay between me and the second prince on your trip to the west this time. It was a very wise decision. From my perspective, I must thank you. Thank me for what? Li Hongcheng smiled bitterly. Thank me for escaping so that when you swing your knife in the future, you won't have the heart to. Both of them laughed. Seeing Li Hongcheng's hand hold the reins, Fan Xian's heart jumped. For the third time, he said, this trip to the west will be difficult. You have to take care. Li Hongcheng was silent for a long time and then gently nodded his head. Flipping onto the horse, he turned to look at Fan Xian. A moment later, he quietly said, if I die in the west, remember to quickly tell Revo the news of my death. Since I'm dead, she won't have to keep hiding in the north. After all, it's a foreign country. Fan Xian knew that the crown prince had guessed the truth behind his sister's study abroad. A wave of shame involuntarily welled up in his heart. Raising his hands in a salute, he forced a face and scolded, come back alive. Li Hongcheng laughed loudly and cracked his whip. The fine horse charged up the slope. Leading the other three riders, they rode straight west along the official road, kicking up plumes of dust. Fan Xian watched this scene with narrowed eyes and secretly prayed for Hongcheng's safety. At dusk, the Overwatch Council's carriages heading to Jiangnan once again passed by the little valley where they had been attacked. Along the way, they could occasionally see the battle marks left on the rocks. Fan Xian licked his slightly dry lips. A powerful, murderous intent surged in his heart. This trip to Jiangnan was to wrap things up. After he had settled everything, he would have to think of a way to chop off the head of that old cabbage farmer of the Qin family. Ever since Qin Hung had been transferred to the position of deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs and lost his position in the Jingdo garrison, the old Qin master still did not attend court as usual. Fan Xian also did not go to the Qin family for New Year's greetings. He only sent a generous gift. Perhaps they did not know that Fan Xian had already guessed who the true culprit of the attack in the valley was. At this moment, Fan Xian was calculating in his heart how the emperor had arranged things. Using the attack in the valley, a few important positions in the court had already been changed to new people and successfully carried out a new generation. However, the old Qin family and the Yi family's prestige in the military was still very strong. The emperor would certainly not be satisfied with the current situation. What exactly would the emperor do? Fan Xian often asked himself if he was sitting on the dragon chair. The purge of the military this time would certainly be done more thoroughly and not as small as it was now. It would still give these military elders enough opportunities to move around. Perhaps it was the sudden advance of Shihu that messed up the emperor's overall plan, or perhaps it was the young northern Qi emperor's clever release of Shang Shanhu that forced the emperor to temporarily keep Yin Xiaoi. However, of the Qin kingdom's 7 roads of elite soldiers, there were still 4 that had not been moved. The corps generals the Great Prince had raised on the Western expedition had yet to be used on the battlefield. Was there a need to rely so heavily on Qin, Yi, and Yan's old power? Fan Xian shook his head and faintly guessed at a certain possibility, such as showing weakness, seduction, or seduction like the Red Plaque girl. However, this kind of plan appeared too absurd and suicidal. Even someone as impudent as Fan Xian did not believe that the emperor would disregard the survival of the Qin kingdom and make such an arrangement. The group of carriages passed through the valley and traveled a few more li before meeting up with the 500 Black Knights. After the silver masked Jing Gu came forward to greet him, he silently retreated back into the Black Knights. With 500 Black Knights patrolling left and right, in the heart of the Qing Kingdom, there was no longer any power that could threaten Fan Xian's safety. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He furrowed his brows and gently clapped his hands. The carriage moved slightly. A common official of the Overwatch Council lifted the curtain and walked in. Fan Xian glanced at him and said with admiration, "No wonder you are the best assassin in the world. Your ability to disguise is indeed much stronger than mine." The shadow didn't smile. Lifelessly, he asked, "What orders do you have?" "Return to the capital." Fan Xian stared into his eyes and said in an unquestionable tone, "Immediately return to the director's side. From now on, don't take a step away from him. You must ensure his safety." The shadow furrowed his brows. He had been personally arranged by Chun Pingping to come to Fan Xian's side. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian suddenly had him return to Chun Pingping's side. Fan Xian didn't explain anything. Straightforwardly, he said, "You know my strength. You also know that he is a cripple. Go." The shadow thought for a bit and nodded. In a moment, he left the group of carriages and became a black shadow. Leisurely passing through the valley and fields, he headed toward Jingdo. Fan Xian confirmed that the shadow would return to Chun Pingping's side. His tense heart finally relaxed. For some reason, he felt very uneasy leaving the capital this time. If it was just the matter of the crown prince, it shouldn't be enough to endanger the old cripple's safety. However, Fan Xian felt a faint fear. He kept feeling that something big beyond his imagination would happen in Jingdo. Once something big came, the people in the palace would not know about the secret power at his father's side. Furthermore, his father had always hidden it well. Even if Jingdo was in turmoil, he would not be the primary target. Chun Pingping was different. If something big really happened, the first thing those people would do would be to gather all their power and think of all ways to kill him. Kill the old dog the emperor relied on the most. This was a truth that had long been proven in the decades of turmoil in the land. If they wanted to kill the Qing emperor, they had to first kill Chun Pingping. Although Fan Xian knew what kind of power and shrewdness the old director had, and how terrifying the defenses outside Qing Garden were, without the shadow by his side, Fan Xian still felt uneasy. The group of carriages traveled south and south. They passed through the hills beside the Wei River, traveled through the mountains north of the river, crossed the river, passed through the newly built dikes, and arrived near Yingzhou. A branch of the river transport governor's yamen was located there. That night, Fan Xian did not summon his student Yang Wanli to see him. For one, he wanted to personally see how Yang Wanli was doing. For another, he was in a hurry to check the council reports from Jingdo, as well as the news from the Jiangnan water bandits. Jingdo was calm. The matter Fan Xian planned had not yet begun, and there were no signs of danger coming. Fan Xian sat by the table and used the faint light to look at the file. He couldn't resist smiling self-mockingly. Perhaps he had been in a dangerous place for too long and appeared overly sensitive. Given the Qing emperor's supreme prestige among the people and the army, as well as his stable loyalty among the Qing court officials, who in this world would dare to rebel? In the middle of the night, the sound of the night watch rang out on the street. Fan Xian had already left the inn alone. He wore a black night traveler's robe that covered his face. Since the situation in the world had not moved, then he had to start on a few small matters. In a broken-down temple outside the city, Fan Xian found the green banner and saw 13th Wang, who was staring at the statue in a daze with his eyes wide open. "I am very satisfied with the little archer's matter." Fan Xian sat across from him and smiled slightly. "I just heard you were also heavily injured. I didn't expect you to be recovering so well." 13th Wang smiled bitterly and said, "My body might be a bit sturdier than others." "It's good that it's sturdier because I'm about to arrange something for you to do," Fan Xian said with a smile. "I will slowly return to Hangzhou and Suzhou, but you have to go first to meet with someone. Then, you will appear on my behalf and help me collect some debts." "Debts?" "Yes," Fan Xian sighed. "Well, a large amount of debts." 13th Wang glanced at him and said, "I can't help with the Ming family matter. You know my brother disciple Yin has been keeping an eye on them." "Nonsense. If it wasn't for Yin Zhilan keeping an eye, Why would I have you go? Fan Xian smiled. This is a business matter. I don't want to fight and kill with Dongi, so it's most appropriate for you to appear. 13th Wang smiled bitterly and said, I am only expressing my teacher's attitude. It doesn't mean I will represent my teacher to suppress brother-disciple Yin. I'm also not stupid enough to believe that Dongi will have internal strife. Fan Xian shook his head and looked at the green banner by his side. However, the owner of this account is me, but it is not convenient for me to appear. Even my students and subordinates cannot appear. I had originally wanted to get a random stranger to do it, but I was afraid the Ming family would be forced into a corner and kill that stranger. Your skill is high, so you don't have to be afraid of these vulgar threats to your life. 13th Wang said in shock. Why do you trust me so much? Aren't you afraid I'll swallow these accounts? Aren't you afraid I'll make it clear to the Ming family? You won't be able to swallow it. You're just going to pretend to be a professional manager. Fan Xian didn't care if he understood these new words and straightforwardly said, As for the Ming family, I've already tied it down. You just need to go out and tighten the knot. 13th Wang sighed sorrowfully and said, Sir Fan Jr., I am not your killer. Attitude. Fan Xian smiled and comforted. Fan Xian smiled and comfortingly said, Attitude decides everything. Since that teacher of yours wants to stand against the wall, then he has to make his attitude clearer. Otherwise, after the Ming family completely collapses, I cannot guarantee that the Eastern Road will be smooth. If the Eastern Road is not smooth, the Qin Kingdom will also suffer. 13th Wang didn't like being threatened. Chapter 491. The temperature in Jiangnan was much warmer than in Jingdou. Although the area around Suzhou and Hangzhou had also experienced heavy snow before, the snow clouds in the sky pulled directly from the seashore to the heart of the Qin Kingdom, enveloping all of the fields and rivers in white snow. As the year passed and winter came to an end, the snow in Jiangnan stopped. Once the sun came out, the snow melted into ice. Immediately, there was no longer a harsh chill. Even the branches of the trees on the side of the road outside Suzhou had already extended out tender little furry leaves. The current master of the Ming family, known as the wealthiest merchant in the world, Ming Qingda, was sitting in a pavilion on a small hill in Ming Garden. His gaze went over the tall courtyard walls and landed on the tender greenery between the trees. Although Ming Garden's courtyard walls were very high, and once the doors were closed, it would become a heavily guarded fortress. However, these high walls could not block his gaze and could not hide the still weak, but gradually burgeoning sense of spring. Although it was winter, he still hoped for spring. Ming Qingda sighed. A glimmer of light appeared on his tired and old face. He happily thought that winter was about to pass. The flowers and grass were about to come back to life. His Ming family, this enormous Ming family, should also come back to life. During this year, the Ming family had experienced too many changes. The enormous profits they had obtained from the palace treasury in the past had been halved. The various sales routes were endlessly harassed by the Overwatch Council. The flow of money, goods, and silver was very difficult. Gradually, it felt like the sun was setting in the west. Furthermore, the old matriarch who secretly controlled the Ming family had been forced to death by the imperial envoy. The third Ming master had almost been exiled, and suddenly, there was the seventh Ming master who had stolen the family property. Countless knives and swords chopped down on the Ming family's head, making it difficult for Ming Qingda to breathe. It was difficult for him to survive. He knew that behind the scenes of these things was the supreme being sitting on the dragon chair, and the executor was the gentle-looking but sinister imperial envoy Fan Xian. Fortunately, during this half a year, Fan Xian had basically stayed in Hangzhou and played in Wuzhou and Danzhou. He rarely returned to the Suzhou Palace Treasury Yamen to oversee matters, particularly in the 2 months before and after the New Year, when Fan Xian left Jiangnan and returned to Jingdou. Fan Xian left Jiangnan. The dark cloud hanging over the Ming family's head also moved away. Although the Jiangnan branch of the Overwatch Council was still working hard to carry out Fan Xian's orders and suppress the Ming family's business, The Ming family had deep connections in Jiangnan. They had countless officials helping them in secret, so the Ming family's business immediately came alive and welcomed a rare liveliness. That was why Ming Qingda had let out a happy sigh when he saw the tender branches outside the wall. However, his face immediately darkened because he suddenly discovered that he had been blinded by joy. Spring had come, the trees had sprouted, but the imperial envoy was also about to return. His mood immediately darkened. He rose angrily and, with a wave of his sleeve, walked toward his own courtyard. Ming Garden took up a large area. Most of the men of the two branches lived in the garden. Originally, according to theory, after the old Ming matriarch died, Ming Qingda, as the master of the family, should have moved into the old matriarch's little courtyard on the highest ground. However, Ming Qingda firmly did not agree to the proposal of the clan. Using the excuse that he missed his mother, he changed the courtyard into the Hall of Remembrance. He knew why he didn't dare move into that little courtyard. He was afraid that once he woke up in that little courtyard, he would see the white towel tied to the beam and that pair of little feet bouncing endlessly. That morning, Ming Qingda took care of some of the business and country matters under the clan in Ming Garden. He picked up a scalding hot towel and wiped his face vigorously. He felt a sense of exhaustion seeping out from his bones. This family was too big. There were too many things to worry about. In the past, as the master of the family, he could easily take care of the specific matters because the general direction and the collusion with the nobles in court were all handled by the old Ming matriarch alone. He didn't need to worry about it. Now, it was different. He had to personally handle secret communications with Jingdo. What gave Ming Qingda the biggest headache was that the imperial envoy had never stopped suppressing the Ming family. With the threat of external aggression looming, there were problems within the Ming family. Fan Xian had forced Xia Qifei, that bastard, into the family through lawsuits. Furthermore, he had heard that the third Ming master had been very close to Xia Qifei recently. In front of the pressure of the court, Ming Qingda didn't have any good ideas. He could only watch as Xia Qifei approached the core of the Ming family step by step. On the first day of a new year a month ago, he had even watched as Xia Qifei returned to the clan to worship his ancestors. With internal troubles and external aggression, Ming Qingda couldn't hold on much longer, but he had to persevere. For this family, he had to endure until the eldest princess succeeded. He glanced at the two people beside him and sighed in his heart. The man and woman beside him were the people he trusted the most. One was his son, Ming Lanshi. The other was the matriarch's personal servant girl in the past, and now his second concubine. If it weren't for this serving girl, it would have been impossible for Ming Qingda to completely take over the old Ming matriarch's secrets and become the true master of the Ming family. Thus, he had made sufficient compensation and love for this woman. As for Ming Lanshi, Ming Qingda glanced at his son and furrowed his brows. He knew that Ming Lanshi was capable and had good foresight. However, father and son had recently had a great conflict over the future of the Ming family. In Ming Lanshi's view, since the court was suppressing so viciously and the palace treasury was firmly controlled by Fan Xian, it was already impossible for the Ming family to obtain large profits from the palace treasury, like in the past. They should take advantage of the current period of peace and gradually withdraw from this business. Using the Ming family's large amount of land in Jiangnan and network in various places, they should no longer be a palace treasury royal merchant and turn to the import trade between Qin Kingdom and Dongyi. This way, the court and imperial envoy would be grateful. Secondly, they could protect the foundation of the Ming family. However, Ming Qingda firmly opposed this suggestion. Even though the Ming family was struggling to hold on, he still did not allow the family to have any intention of leaving the palace treasury and developing in another direction. The second concubine left the front hall. Ming Qingda looked at his son and furrowed his brows. "Your suggestion last night won't do." "Why?" Ming Lanshi said unhappily. "Who can go against the court? If we don't retreat now, when Fan Xian returns to Jiangnan, I'm afraid we won't be able to retreat even if we want to." What can Fan Xian do? Ming Qingda glanced at him and said, "Can he move troops and kill us all? Who knows? That imperial envoy is the emperor's illegitimate child. If he really messes around, who would he be afraid of?" Ming Launcher knew that Fan Xian would not use such a method, but he still couldn't resist saying it. "We also have people in the palace." Ming Qingda furrowed his brows. "The Empress Dowager, Empress, eldest princess, are these nobles no match for the emperor's illegitimate child? Then what about the business? If Fan Xian continues to do what he did last year, how much silver will the Ming family have to put in to make up for the deficit?" Ming Launcher angrily said, "Before, in the palace treasury business, we could earn as much as we wanted. Now we're losing money on every deal. When the bids are set, the price was set too high. It is impossible to make a profit, and the Overwatch Council people make trouble every day. Father, if this goes on, we won't be able to last much longer. In another 3 months, I think the clan will have to start selling land. What's the rush?" Ming Qingda disagreed. "The palace treasury business must continue. This is what the eldest princess wants. If we leave now, perhaps Fan Xian will let us go, but how will we explain it to the eldest princess? Without the palace treasury bids, the Ming family is just a fat piece of meat that could be eaten at any moment." He didn't realize that he had said these words to his son a year ago. "Then, at least send less goods to Dongyi, so we can lose less," Ming Launcher said probingly. Ming Qingda shook his head and said resolutely and decisively, "No, we can't offend Sigu Jian. We still need Taiping Money House's silver." Speaking of silver, the father and son fell silent at the same time. Under the full suppression of the court and Fan Xian, the reason the Ming family had been able to hold out until now and keep the family's fertile land was all because of their good relationship with Dongyi and the endless supply of silver from Taiping Money House and Zhaoshang Money House. What if Taiping Zhaoshang feels that our family can't hold out and wants to collect silver? Collect silver? What we're mortgaging is the land and business. Ming Qingda smiled coldly. What use is there for the money house to take so much? Can they sell it? They can only continue to support us. Otherwise, what they take back is just some dead things that can't make money. What should we do? Endure. Ming Qingda stood up and tightened his fist slightly. He coughed and said firmly, "As long as there are no problems with Taiping Money House and Zhaoshang Money House, we can endure. Even Fan Xian can't do anything to me." "How long do we have to endure?" Ming Launcher looked at the ups and downs of the family this year. His spirit could not hold out much longer. "Endure until Fan Xian falls. Endure until the emperor knows he was wrong." Ming Qingda's eyes were sunken. There was a glimmer of ruthlessness in his exhaustion. "Even if it's 2 or 3 years, we have to endure. We have to wait for movement from Jingdou. Right now, there are too many places in the family that need silver. I'm afraid we'll have to continue moving silver from the money house," Ming Launcher said worriedly. The clan's share was forced to give a share to Xia Qifei. Ming Qingda closed his eyes and calculated. Even if the third and fourth aunts have ulterior motives, they don't have much on hand. Most of it is in our hands. As long as the money house doesn't cross the line, it will be fine. Although the scheming and far-sighted merchant did not think that Taiping Zhaoshang Money House would suddenly pull out firewood from under the pot, he, who had always been cautious, knew that he had to keep the risk to the lowest. The street in Suzhou full of money houses and pawn shops was not very long. The stone-lined street appeared particularly quiet. Those who could come here were either poor to a certain extent or rich to a certain extent. As the successor of the Ming family, Ming Launcher was the latter. When he quietly came to the money house with the Zhaoshang banners, he was immediately respectfully welcomed in by the head shopkeeper of the Zhaoshang Money House. Ever since Fan Xian had come to Jiangnan, the Ming family's efforts to transfer silver outside had increased, particularly with the palace treasury bidding. Even with the powerful power of Taiping Money House spread throughout the world, they were unable to raise so much silver in a short time. Thus, the Ming family took a risk and asked Zhaoshang Money House for help. Unexpectedly, Zhaoshang Money House agreed with great difficulty. This cooperation left a very good impression on the Ming family. After carrying out a detailed background investigation, the Ming family confirmed that the source of Zhaoshang Money House's funds came from the inheritance of Shun Zhong's family, the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards, as well as a family in Dongyi. Thus, they relaxed. The cooperation between the two sides increased day by day and was seamless. Zhaoshang Money House had already become the Ming family's largest partner other than Taiping Money House. In a year, the Ming family had already moved out more than 3 million liang of silver from this money house. Ming Launcher had come again to transfer silver. The two sides very familiarly signed the contract and notarial deed and completed each other's procedures. The head shopkeeper of Zhaoshang Money House suddenly revealed a difficult expression and said, "Young Master Ming, there is something I don't know if I should say." Ming Launcher furrowed his brows slightly, but his heart thumped. He wondered if Zhaoshang Money House had suddenly developed some kind of suspicion toward the Ming family. As expected, the plain-looking head shopkeeper probingly said, "These 2 months have been good, but I heard the imperial envoy is about to return to Jiangnan." Ming Launcher huffed coldly. The entire world knew that his family was not on good terms with the imperial envoy, but Zhaoshang Money House had not been afraid before. "Why were you afraid now?" The head shopkeeper smiled warmly and said, "The Ming family has been dominant in the Jiangnan business world for 100 years. Naturally, our little money house would not suspect anything. However, let me remind you, there are many money-making businesses in this world. Why must you fight against the court?" Ming Launcher's heart jumped. This perfectly matched his intention of moving the Ming family onto another path. However, he was, after all, not directly involved in the Ming family. He also had a glimmer of suspicion toward this head shopkeeper's sudden reminder. In front of this outsider, he wouldn't say anything. He smiled slightly and said, "What business can make more money than the palace treasury?" The head shopkeeper chuckled and didn't say anything more. After the Ming family's carriage left the street made of stone, the head shopkeeper of Zhaoshang Money House bent his body slightly and returned to the heavily guarded inner storeroom at the back. The storeroom stored silver and bills from various places. It was clear that the head shopkeeper placed great importance on the Ming family's bill of exchange in his hand. He carefully placed it in a separate wooden box and glanced inside. The bills inside were already very thick. If Zhaoshang Money House forced the Ming family to pay back the money, the Ming family would not break their contract with the court and break away from the palace treasury sales. Then they could only sell off their rich family property to pay back the money. Of course, Zhaoshang Money House would not do such a thing. The head shopkeeper suddenly thought of something and smiled at the assistant beside him. "How much silver has the sixth master borrowed?" "It has already exceeded the limit," the assistant said respectfully. He greatly admired the head shopkeeper's methods because he knew that Zhaoshang Money House now actually owned nearly half of the Ming family. Although the value of the Ming family's property was definitely more than this, things like wealth, once reflected on bills, would always shrink a lot at a rather clever moment. "That customer has a seal?" "Yes." The head shopkeeper nodded. He knew that his master was preparing to take action. However, hadn't he still not returned to Jiangnan? In the side room behind Zhaoshang Money House, the head shopkeeper saw the green banner at a glance and respectfully asked, "Sir, what should we do next?" 13th Wang had come to Zhaoshang Money House the moment he entered Suzhou. He knew of the cooperative relationship between this money house and the Ming family, but he had never thought, no one in the world would have thought, that this money house was Fan Xian's. His lips tasted bitter. He once again felt why his teacher valued Fan Xian so much and why he had him represent a portion of his attitude. He also knew that the words Fan Xian had said to him in that broken temple were not false. Zhaoshang Money House already had enough of the Ming family's promissory notes. In this matter, he was only a hired thug to collect the debts. It was impossible for him to change all of this. Even if he notified Dongyi and the Ming family right now, it was impossible to change what was already set in stone. The Ming family was finished. More accurately speaking, before Ming Qingda knelt in front of Fan Xian and secretly killed the old Ming matriarch, using a mournful attitude to ask for the sympathy of the world and delay Fan Xian's lightning strike. The Ming family was already finished. All of the Ming family's efforts were superfluous actions and a powerless struggle. The reason Fan Xian had never taken action was because he had previously had to deal with the pressure from Jingdo. For him to take action now, it must be because he knew that the nobles in Jingdo no longer had the extra power to help the Ming family. 13th Wang furrowed his brows and wondered what method Fan Xian would use to delay the eldest princess support for the Ming family in Jingdo. I don't understand these things. 13th Wang sighed. When are you going to collect the debts? I'll go with you. The head shopkeeper smiled. A long time ago, he was a successful official in the Ministry of Revenue. Now, he was a successful usury operator. When it came to clearing shops, he was very good at it. There will be more actions from the owner's side. I'll have to trouble you to wait a few more days in Suzhou. 13th Wang thought that if Fan Xian wanted to clear out the Ming family, relying on promissory notes alone would not be enough. What other actions would he take? Fan Xian's actions in Jiangnan began early because he needed this time difference. The Jingdo actions that truly led to the Jiangnan actions also slowly began at this moment. One day in February, the owner of the Dongi embroidery shop, who had been dragged around until his head was in a mess, finally received a piece of good news. The banknotes he had sent out had worked. Tomorrow, yes, tomorrow, the embroidery cloth would enter the palace. Tomorrow, yes, tomorrow, the monthly tickets will stop doubling. Everyone who still has tickets in their hands, toss them over. Thank you. Chapter 492. The second month was the spring equinox. Flowers bloomed and withered according to the time. It was not yet time for the 100 flowers to rise to the sky. Temporarily, one would plant the spirit of spring with skillful hands. Where was the spirit of spring planted? It was planted on people's clothes. The petals fluttered and folded in the golden embroidery. The day before, the Western embroidered cloth that the Empress had requested had finally entered the palace. No one knew how many bolts of cloth there were, but it had worked a number of eunuchs in the palace. The person who had brought the cloth in from outside the palace was Hong Zhu. For a small matter like distributing it today, a small matter that required physical strength, he was too lazy to do it himself. He stayed in the main hall of the Eastern Palace and noticed that the crown prince was not there. As he carefully pulled out the brass pieces in the incense burner to prevent the incense from burning too quickly, he quietly ordered the serving girls to be more diligent and quickly spread out the 3 layers of cotton mattress because the Empress would be reading in a moment. Before long, a wave of fragrant wind brushed past. The inner curtain was lifted. The Empress, with black brows, red lips, and a pair of flowing red phoenix eyes, walked out with a slight limp. She reclined on the low couch and drank the freshly brewed incense while reading the book in her hand. The book was a collection of stories published by Damba Bookstore. Although the Empress hated Fan Xian and feared him, in her daily pastimes, this mother of the country did not want to lower the quality of her life. After skimming through a few pages, the Empress' brows furrowed. No one knew what she was thinking. At this moment, Hong Zhu was behind the Empress massaging her back. That pair of exceptionally clean little fists gently and orderly smashed into the Empress's thin body. The Empress had always liked Hong Zhu's playfulness and attentiveness to his service, particularly his skill at massaging her back. Today, she did not close her eyes to enjoy it, as she usually did. Instead, she stared at the book in front of her in a daze. "What are you thinking about, Empress?" Hong Zhu asked with a slight smile. Compared to these nobles, the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace were like ants in the mud. Thus, when normal people saw nobles like the Empress, they didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. They were timid and respectful, wishing they could pull back their hands and feet. However, Hong Zhu had once received Fan Xian's teachings. He also felt that although these nobles seemed to have a high position and power, wore luxurious clothes and ate good food, and had nothing to be dissatisfied with, it was these nobles who easily felt that life in the palace was boring and lonely. They liked people to talk to them. Ever since Hongzhu had served in the royal study, he had been different from other eunuchs. He would not always lower his head and never forget to act like a servant. Rather, other than being respectful, there was a hint of magnanimity in the way he handled matters. In fact, the reason was very simple. The nobles in the palace also needed to talk, but their status meant that they had no close friends to communicate with. If the little eunuch who had always been by their side didn't look so wretched and act so bashfully, they would feel much better. That was why Hongzhu was loved by so many nobles, including the empress. The empress seemed to be used to talking to Hongzhu. She sighed and said, "I was just thinking. I'm tired of always being in the palace. Anne has been a vegetarian and chanting scriptures these 2 days. I haven't had many opportunities to see her." Hongzhu smiled and said, "It is good for me to accompany you and talk for a while." He had to say that he was a slave, but he couldn't put on the appearance of a lowly slave. Otherwise, the master would only have the desire to slap him in the face when he saw the lowly slave and would never have the thought of communicating with him. "What can you say? Why don't we do what we did a few days ago and tell us about the days you spent wandering outside the palace when you were a child?" The empress asked with interest. After Hongzhu's family was ruined by corrupt officials, he and his brother fled to Jiaozhou. In those years, who knew how much suffering they had suffered and how many joys and sorrows of the human world? In terms of experience, he was much richer than these nobles who had grown up in noble families. Especially the secrets of the beggars, the rumors of the Jianghu, and the eating and playing of the common people. When they fell into the ears of the empress, they seemed so fresh and interesting. Today, Hongzhu was telling a true joke he had heard on his wanderings. It had to do with the girls in the brothels. After all, he was in the royal palace, and the person listening to the story was the mother of the country. Thus, Hongzhu was particularly careful when he told the story and didn't dare to say too many explicit words. As the empress listened to this story, a ripple appeared in her eyes. She smiled slightly and felt that it was amusing. She quickly yawned to hide it. She was in front of Hongzhu, so he couldn't see. He just felt surprised that the empress didn't stop him from continuing. After all, he was young. How could he know that no matter how sacred and inviolable a noble was, in reality, the things in their minds were no different from those of the women in the marketplace? After he finished the story, the empress sighed and said, "The children of the common people do indeed have a hard time, but they can also see some different things." Hongzhu smiled awkwardly and said, "It's hard. What kind of person is the empress?" Since childhood, this naturally led the topic to the empress's childhood. For a moment, the empress was lost in thought. She thought of the present emperor. When she was young, he was still that unsmiling cousin. It seemed that they had occasionally had happy times together. However, later on, how did it become like this? She immediately thought of the price her family had paid on that night, when Jingdo bled with blood. Her emotions began to become unstable and gradually gained a sense of sorrow. Hongzhu carefully controlled his words. He used his peripheral vision to watch the frequency of the empress's eyelashes blinking. He then turned the content of the conversation to the little playthings of the empress in her childhood. At this moment, the empress was warning herself in her heart. Furthermore, she couldn't tell a servant too much about herself. Hearing him change the topic, her heart relaxed, and she began to count like she was counting her family treasures. After countless twists and turns, Hongzhu finally succeeded in, without leaving a trace, making the empress think of a piece of jade. A piece of jade that she had brought into the palace from her paternal family. The empress gestured at the size of the jade and said with a smile, "The quality of that piece of jade is not bad. Of course, it can't compare to the tributes stored on Dong Mountain. However, it would still be a rare quality in a normal noble family. Oh right, that was given to my paternal family by the previous emperor. Thus, the engraving on it is the emperor's style. It is impossible to wear it outside." The empress unintentionally pointed at her chest. Although she was wearing a thick winter coat, her fingers still sank into her ample bosom. Hongzhu gently swallowed and quietly said with a smile, "I don't think I've seen the empress wear it in the palace." Although that jade pendant is quite warm, the water is too shallow. I used to wear it when I was a girl, but it doesn't suit me now. Hongzhu fawningly said, Your Highness is a heavenly beauty, not less beautiful than before. What difference is there between you and a girl? No matter how shallow the water, it is still suitable. A stern look flashed in the Empress' eyes. She lowered her voice and shouted, Your words are getting more and more impudent. Hongzhu's expression was filled with shock. He quickly slapped himself heavily in the mouth, but he still did not notice the trace of a satisfied smile at the corners of the Empress' lips or the growing meaning in her eyes. Yesterday, the Empress had learned of the news of the embroidered cloth entering the palace. Naturally, she did not worry about such a small matter. Naturally, there were rules in the palace to send it to the various palaces. The Empress Dowager's side was the first, as well as the famous ladies in the palace. In the end, it was the eldest Princess Guangxin Palace. Although the Empress had never liked this sister-in-law, for the sake of her son, she had to be careful. At this time, the back room of the Eastern Palace was busy distributing the embroidered cloth. After Hongzhu served the Empress, he had nothing else to do. With nothing to do, he stood outside the door and stared at the slender serving girls busying about. His gaze swept across the serving girls' full and slightly perky buttocks. Suddenly, he felt a pain in his waist. Turning his head to look, he saw a charming palace maid glaring at him hatefully. He couldn't help but scold in a low voice. Show her you're crazy. There are so many people, and this is in the palace. This serving girl, who was brave enough to pinch the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace, was the shower that Fan Xian had once heard of. She was also the companion that Hongzhu had found in the loneliness of the palace. Shower bit her lower lip and muttered, Where are your eyes looking? You also know this is in the palace? Hongzhu chuckled and said a few words of comfort. He thought to himself, as a eunuch, he could only use his eyes and fingers to satisfy his cravings. What was there to be jealous about? He didn't think much of it. However, he suddenly thought of something and asked curiously, What are you doing here? His heart suddenly jumped. Lowering his voice, he said, Don't tell me she wants you to go to the various palaces to deliver embroidered cloth? Shower looked curiously at his nervous expression and said with slight surprise, No, I don't know what happened today, but the Empress suddenly remembered a small object that she hadn't used in a long time and wanted me to go into the side room to look for it. Hongzhu's mood relaxed slightly. He carefully asked, What object is it? A light green jade, Shower pouted. I don't know who was the one who talked too much and made the Empress think of this thing. It's something that hasn't been used in many years. How could she find it in such a short time? If she can't find it, how will she explain it to the Empress? Hongzhu was overjoyed. He knew that what he said earlier had finally had an effect. The Empress had finally remembered to find that piece of jade. At this moment, a serving girl covered her mouth and laughed as she walked past the two of them. Shower angrily said, What are you laughing at? The serving girl stuck out her tongue and said, Only you guys can laugh, but I can't. The Qin Kingdom's kingdom was actually not as bright and grand as the common people imagined, but it was also not as dark and terrifying as the novels made it out to be. Particularly in the Eastern Palace, the Empress was well aware of her weakness and helplessness, so she purposefully put effort into these details. She was relatively gentle toward the serving girls and eunuchs and not very strict with the emperor. She had the intention of building a good relationship. Hongzhu was also someone who was used to being careful. Even though he had become the head eunuch, he was not very bossy toward the people below him. That was why the serving girl dared to joke around with the two of them. Where are you going? Hongzhu smiled slightly as he looked at the serving girl, as well as the little eunuch holding 2 rolls of high-quality embroidered cloth behind her. The palace maid giggled and bowed, saying, This is for Guangxin Palace. Hongzhu smiled and nodded, allowing her to go. The serving girl was called Wang Zhe. To have a surname meant that she was a rather favored figure in the Eastern Palace. She brought 2 little eunuchs to Guangxin Palace. Knowing the eldest princess's habits, she waved her hand and had the 2 little eunuchs wait outside, while she laboriously carried the embroidered cloth in. Naturally, there were eldest princess serving girls in the palace to receive it. Since it was someone representing the empress, the eldest princess casually said a few words to the serving girl, asked after the empress, and sent her out. When Guangxin Palace was quiet and empty, the eldest princess moved behind the screen and looked at the Qing Kingdom's crown prince, whose face was full of happiness. Smiling warmly, she said, "Have you memorized the 3 strategies for governing a country?" The crown prince gazed at her with infatuation and nodded his head. Gently holding the eldest princess' soft, almost boneless hand like he was holding a fragile and easily broken piece of jade, he brought it to the side of his face and rubbed it against it. In a quiet voice, he said, "Chinner has already memorized it." The eldest princess gently used a finger to touch the spot between his brows. Looking at the familiar mark between the crown prince's brows, for some reason, her heart throbbed and then softened. Using both hands to hold his face, she moved her eyes slightly and said in a gentle voice, "Be good, recite it for me." In the Eastern Palace, the empress was throwing a temper tantrum because the serving girls had searched for a long time and still hadn't found Shui Qing's jade. This made the empress in a bad mood. Xiaoer stood fearfully by the empress's side. She thought to herself, why does this mistress have to work so hard on that piece of jade? She had no idea that the empress had been moved by Hong Zhu's words and wanted to find some of the tale of time from many years ago. Search carefully for me. The empress was very angry. She had only occasionally wanted to find something, but in the end, she couldn't find it. She was lenient, but these servants dared to overturn the heavens. She had faintly heard that there were people with dirty hands and feet in the palace, but she had never thought that there would be someone so daring as to stretch their hands into the Eastern Palace. Thinking of how she was alone and without help in the royal palace, and was now being bullied by these dog servants, the empress was so angry that her lips trembled. She coldly said to the row of eunuchs kneeling in front of her, "If you can't find it in the storeroom, then search every room." The expressions of the row of people kneeling below were very ugly. They all thought to themselves, are they preparing to raid the palace? The 3 eunuchs on the lower right were so scared their faces were deathly white. Their hearts were filled with shock. All of the old and used items in the Eastern Palace had been stolen out of the palace by them to be sold. The piece of jade the empress had mentioned earlier was among them. Fortunately, everyone had been frightened badly by the empress's sharp and dark scolding. Their expressions were not very good, so the little drum in the hearts of the 3 eunuchs was not detected by others. The empress slammed her right hand heavily onto the table. The emerald ring on her right middle finger shattered with a crack. She angrily said, "Find out who has dirty hands and feet. There's no need to report to me. Just directly kill them." Hong Zhu lowered his head and looked at the pieces of emerald on the table. He smiled bitterly and thought that this ring was worth much more than the jade. He knew that the empress wanted to suddenly have an idea and be angry in her heart. She wanted to use this to establish her power in the palace, so he couldn't say much. He bowed slightly and accepted the order. He then led a few high-ranking serving girls and eunuchs to search the palace. In an instant, there was a flurry of footsteps in the side courtyard behind the Eastern Palace. The sound of chests and cabinets being overturned rang out. It was like a raid. It made one's heart tremble unspeakably. The serving girls and eunuchs who were obediently waiting outside the door for their fate's orders were not very worried. Even the 3 eunuchs who had handled it were not afraid. They had done this kind of thing many times. No one would be stupid enough to hide the taboo stolen goods in their own rooms. However, it seemed that some people were indeed that stupid. The 3 eunuchs were dumbstruck. The serving girl who had been looking at them with an arrogant expression suddenly paled. In a sharp voice, she said, "This isn't mine. This isn't mine." In order to avoid arousing suspicion, Hong Zhu did not personally go into search. When he saw a eunuch find the jade from under the serving girl's bed, he couldn't resist sighing. Gazing at the serving girl, he shook his head. This serving girl was the one who had sent the cloth to Guangxin Palace earlier. Her face was deathly pale, and her eyes were filled with confusion. With a bang, she knelt in front of Hongzhu and said in a trembling voice, "Young eunuch Hong, it has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with me, nothing to do with me." The three eunuchs who had truly stolen the jade looked at each other. They thought, hadn't this jade already been sold out of the palace? How could it suddenly appear in the Eastern Palace and in the hands of that serving girl? The three eunuchs immediately broke out in a cold sweat because of the appearance of stolen goods. Who knew what problems would arise from the interrogation later? Hongzhu furrowed his brows and looked at the serving girl kneeling in front of him. He sighed and said, "Tie her up and wait for the lady's orders." A few of the sturdier eunuchs went forward and flipped the serving girl to the ground. They used hemp rope to tie her up securely. The serving girl was already unconscious from fear. She could only endlessly cry out that she had been wronged and say she had never seen this piece of jade. Hongzhu shook his head and went to the front of the palace to report. The three eunuchs looked at each other. One of the braver ones followed behind Hongzhu and said in a low voice, "Sir, earlier, the lady's intention was to find the thing and directly beat the lowly one to death. If we tell the lady now, I'm afraid she won't be happy. It wouldn't be good to implicate you." Hongzhu stopped his steps and thought for a bit. This matter is too big. It's best to wait for the masters to speak. As servants, we shouldn't meddle too much. A glimmer of disappointment flashed through the eunuch's eyes. He had originally wanted to borrow Hongzhu's hand to directly kill the serving girl. Then, no matter how the jade entered the palace again, as long as the person was already dead and the jade came back, it would not be traced back to him. He had not thought that Hongzhu would still go ask for the empress's orders. How could it be so simple? Hongzhu smiled coldly and glanced at him. How could she be so daring to steal something from the palace alone? There must be someone else helping her cover it up. Even if there wasn't a helper, where did this thing come from? In a bit, we will have the people of the internal court investigate it carefully. We will certainly be able to find the source. The eunuch's heart chilled. He thought to himself that the source, if the investigation continued, wouldn't the three of them be pulled out? No matter what, he did not dare to admit this matter to Hongzhu. He only asked probingly, "I wonder how the empress will deal with this. If they truly find a scourge in the palace, beating her to death is good. I'm just afraid that she will be thrown into the celestial prison and tortured by the Overwatch Council." Hongzhu sighed. The eunuch's eyes turned, and he swallowed fearfully. After all, this is a palace matter. If the people of the internal court and Overwatch Council investigate, I'm afraid the empress will lose face. How about we investigate it ourselves first? Hongzhu seemed to be moved by these words. Glancing out of the corner of his eye, he happened to see a glimmer of murderous intent in the eunuch's eyes. He smiled and nodded his head, ordering, "Investigate it carefully." When they arrived at the bedchamber in the front of the palace, Hongzhu's expression changed. He first told the empress the information he had already found. He then sincerely urged the empress to deal with the matter with leniency. After all, the Empress Dowager had been on a vegetarian diet these days. If someone died, she would probably not be happy. The empress was originally very angry, but after Hongzhu's persuasion, her anger gradually dissipated. She held Shui Qing'er's jade in her hand and slowly stroked it. Furrowing her brows, she said, "That makes sense. However, death can be forgiven, but punishment cannot be avoided. Give the order to beat him heavily." Hongzhu accepted the order and was preparing to go to the back when the empress called him back and said, "What are you going to do? Just give the order. Stay here with me. I've always heard you boast about your dexterity with your hands. Weave a golden thread to tie this piece of jade together." The empress's expression was calm. No emotion could be heard from her. Hongzhu was secretly happy. He thought to himself that if he was asked to lead the investigation, who knew if he would be dragged into it? After an indeterminable amount of time, a eunuch knelt outside the palace with an ugly expression. Hongzhu furrowed his brows and went over to listen to him say something. His expression also became ugly. He moved closer to the empress's ear and quietly said a few words. The empress's beautiful brows furrowed, and she said with disgust, "How inauspicious It's fine if you can't take a beating, but at least you have some sense of shame and know to commit suicide to be clean. This mother of the nation casually said, "Have Jingle Hall drag it away and burn it." Hongzhu's heart trembled slightly. He knew that in the eyes of these nobles, servants like him were only objects to be ordered around and toyed with. Human lives were not worth as much as ants. He silently bowed and then went to make arrangements for the serving girl's funeral. He knew that the serving girl's death was certainly not as simple as suicide. It had to have been secretly done by the eunuch he had arranged to interrogate her in order to silence her and protect his glory, wealth, life, and wealth. However, this was something Hongzhu had arranged, so he was not very surprised. He only felt a glimmer of guilt toward the innocent serving girl. The Qing kingdom's royal palace was very large, taking up a quarter of Jingdo's area. Inside lived the noblest men and women in the world, as well as the lowliest women and people who were neither male nor female. In this cold palace, who knew how many stories happened every day? Who knew how many lowly people would mysteriously or silently disappear or die, and no one would remember that they had ever existed in the palace? Although the Qing royal family was not known for their strictness, this kind of strict barrier between classes meant that the royal palace would forever be a dog-eat-dog place. Thus, the death of a common serving girl in the Eastern Palace did not attract much attention. It was just that there was an extra body on Jingle Hall's burning ground. There was a girl in the embroidery bureau who was lucky enough to obtain the opportunity to enter the Eastern Palace to serve the Empress. The Empress continued to listen to Hongzhu's jokes every day. The Empress Dowager continued to eat vegetables every day. The Crown Prince continued to learn how to govern a country every day and then went to Guangxin Palace to ask the eldest princess for advice. Everything was as usual. As long as it is a big clan, if someone attacks from the outside, it will not be destroyed immediately because it has a strong foundation. However, if there is a problem within the clan and people start to attack each other, suspicion and internal strife will become the norm, then the day of death will not be far. On the newly built earthen dike in Yingzhou, Fan Xian watched the river below the dike roll toward the east. Deep in thought, he said, "A 1,000-li dike can be destroyed by an ant's nest. A 1,000-year family can be destroyed by a thought." He turned his head to the dark-faced Yang Wanli and said, "I'm not just talking about the river dike you built or the Ming family. I'm also talking about the world." Fan Xian did not make his words clear. He calculated the time. Today should be the day the serving girl died. After a few more days, when the rumors spread and the emperor noticed the strange death of the serving girl in the Eastern Palace, given his suspicious nature, he would certainly find many problems. The tranquility and harmony of the royal family on the surface might cause an unexpected upheaval because of the death of that palace maid. I'm seriously asking for your monthly votes here. In a few hours, the doubling of the monthly votes will end, and the friends behind me have narrowed the gap by 600 votes in one night. I'm feeling a little tight. I want to be in the top 3 this month, and these few hours will play a very important role. So, please throw the votes in your hands over to me and tamp down the soil and stones. Thank you, thank you. Chapter 493. Yang Wanli glanced at Fan Xian beside him and said, "Teacher, the Jiangnan matter has been settled. You don't have to worry too much." His words were spoken with sincerity and sincerity. Yang Wanli had experienced more than half a year of wind and rain on the river embankment and wrangling and shirking in the river transport governor's yamen. He had long gradually understood the true meaning of being an official and the difficulties of the people's lives. As an official, if they wanted to work for the people and share the burdens of the court, they had to have power and money in their hands. Otherwise, they couldn't do anything. Because Yang Wanli had Fan Xian as a backer, no superior in the Ministry of Works dared to order him around. Although the river transport governor's yamen was still a mess, he had the power to directly take silver from the palace treasury. Thus, in this area, no one could create obstacles for him. He was no longer the pure young man who dared to make a ruckus at his students with a wave of his sleeves. Every time he thought of this, he deeply admired the lesson his teacher had taught him by Westlake in Hangzhou. At this moment, the endless river embankment beneath their feet was Yang Wanli's achievements in this 1 year. Every time he looked at the square stones and yellow earth and the tamed river water below the embankment, his heart was always filled with fulfillment and pride. The patched clothes on his body and his dark face all became a symbol of glory. Yang Wanli knew that the reason he was able to achieve his dreams in life was because of Minister Fan and Sir Fan Jr.'s meticulous care and guidance. Thus, he was both happy and worried about his teacher's arrival, which was why he said the words he had said earlier. Everyone under heaven knew that Fan Xian had been attacked on his way back to the capital. Yang Wanli was very worried about his teacher's health. Fan Xian shook his head and looked at the river water under his feet. "It's fine. Don't think too highly of me. I'm a lazy person. I won't be busy with government affairs and harm my health." As for the Jiangnan matter, the Ming family's weakness has long been grasped. Naturally, they have no power to retaliate. However, if they want to take them all in one bite, it will still be difficult. Yang Wanli could understand the meaning behind these words. It was not difficult to take out the Ming family. What was important was the members of the royal family behind the Ming family. If he did not have to worry about the situation in the palace, the Ming family would have long been taken out by him. Fan Xian smiled and did not go into detail about the specific situation. He only comfortingly said, "Returning to the capital this time has been fruitful. Although the emperor has not made up his mind to clean up the bureaucracy, the change in the court has already begun. You should have seen Cheng Jialin's name on the court bulletin." "Yes, Brother Jialin is the first of the four of us to return to the imperial court," Yang Wanli said happily. The investigation into Fan Xian's assassination had ended without any results. The Qing emperor had used the opportunity to chase away some old people and install many new people into the court. The least famous of Fan Xian's four disciples, Cheng Jialin, had met him respectfully and jumped ranks to be promoted. Presently, he was already the vice director of the Ministry of Rights and a target of the court's training. Fan Xian glanced at him and smiled. "Of the four of you, Jialin is the most silent and moderate. It is because of this that his path has been smoother than Jichang's. Of course, Jichang's problem is also mine. If I had not called him to Jiaozhou, he would not have sunk into this kind of stalemate. I just hope he doesn't blame me." Yang Wanli shook his head and said, "Teacher, what are you saying? Jichang has also written to me about the Jiaozhou matter. This is an important matter, and only Jichang can handle it." Fan Xian nodded. Since the four of them knew of his painstaking efforts, then he didn't need to explain anymore. The two of them walked downstream along the long river embankment. As they walked, they chatted. Fan Xian reminded him, "I know about your matters in the River Works Yamen, and the court also knows. Now that the title of desperately working for Wanli has entered the palace, it will be of great benefit to you in the future. However, you still have to remember what I said back then. For things like river works, if you know how to do it, then work hard. Don't randomly give orders for things you don't understand." Yang Wanli smiled and replied, "After spending a year on the river embankment, even if I don't understand something, I understand a little." Fan Xian glanced at him disapprovingly and said, "The river works are a major matter, even more important than the battles on the western Hu and northern Qi borders. If you only understand a little, how can this little be enough to support you to say such confident words?" Yang Wanli immediately understood and shamefully accepted the lesson. Of course, it is impossible to stop the river disaster in a mere year's time. Fan Xian suddenly furrowed his brows and said, "This is a 10-year work or even a 100-year work. As long as people live on the two sides of the river, they will have to work for as many years. You have to stop being arrogant and impatient. You should be willing to be lonely." "Yes, teacher. However, you also have to pay attention to raising a few capable subordinates and specialists," Fan Xian said sincerely. Fan Xian sincerely said, "Although you have the desire to benefit tens of thousands of people, you've been exposed to wind and rain for a long time. I'm afraid your body won't be able to take it. You've raised capable people, so don't stay in the River Works Yamen anymore. Go back to the capital and work seriously. Yang Wanli was startled and quickly explained, Teacher, I don't want to go back to the capital. The capital is much more troublesome than the embankment. Besides, I'm not afraid of hardship. I've long gotten used to it. Of course, the capital is troublesome, but if you want to work, you have to go back to the capital, Fan Xian said resolutely. Fan Xian said resolutely and decisively. This has nothing to do with whether or not you can endure this hardship. I still hope that you can live a few more years. You're already so old, yet you haven't even taken a wife. What kind of rumors would it be if it got out? Yang Wanli was vexed and didn't say anything. Speaking of which, it was strange. Fan Xian was younger than all four of his students, but during these 2 years, when they occasionally ran into each other and Fan Xian put on the airs of a teacher to lecture them, he had become more and more used to it. This was probably what was meant by changing places and nurturing one's temperament. In the next few days, Fan Xian continued to linger in Yingzhou. Most of the time, he was on the river embankment pointing and discussing with Yang Wanli. However, he could not avoid being invited to a banquet by the River Works Governor's Yamen. Fan Xian could refuse a normal local official, but this time, the River Works Governor had personally come to invite him to a banquet. This kind of face was rare. The governor's reason for inviting Fan Xian was simple. What the River Works Governor's Yamen lacked was silver. Fan Xian was in charge of the palace treasury and had plenty of silver. This year, the River Works Governor's Yamen had smoothly repaired the river and received great reward from the emperor. It was because Fan Xian, both openly and secretly, had invested great enthusiasm and countless silver into this yamen. The governor could not help but be endlessly grateful for this kind of favor. What Yang Wanli found strange was why his teacher had remained in Yingzhou. Of course, the imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road could inspect the construction of the embankment. Looking at Fan Xian's appearance, he was prepared to stay for half a month. Teacher, are you not going to Suzhou? One day, Yang Wanli gathered his courage and asked. There's no rush. I'll wait a bit longer. Fan Xian smiled. Jingdou was in the north, and Suzhou was in the east. He sat steadily in Yingzhou, coldly watching what was about to happen in the two places. It was like a porter carrying 2 loads of thorny fruits. He just happened to place the carrying pole on his shoulder to support the weight, but he was not worried about the thorny fruits piercing his thigh. He was waiting for the Suzhou matter to first enter the main topic, and then for the Jingdou matter to explode. Yingzhou was the best place to watch the show. Although he was very repulsive in the eyes of the officials under heaven, at such a sensitive time, he still needed to avoid arousing suspicion. The Qinian unit of the Overwatch Council in Jiangnan had 2 leading figures. One was Su Wanmao, who managed the production of the palace treasury in the 3 workshops in North Min. The other was Hong Chongqing, who kept an eye on the Ming family's movements in the palace treasury transport company in Suzhou. The movements against the Ming family had actually been laid out a year ago, and the true movements had begun half a year ago. On one hand, Zhaoshang Money House vigorously transferred silver to the Ming family to support their channels and daily needs. They also began to provoke Ming Launcher to open up a new business route. At the same time, they also made a move against the 6th Master, who only liked sumo wrestling. That muddle-headed 6th Master only knew that Zhaoshang Money House had borrowed a lot of silver from him to spend, but he had never thought that his shares in the Ming family had long become a few pieces of paper in Zhaoshang Money House. All of this was carried out in the open. Even if Zhaoshang Money House were to press for a debt, given the Ming family's powerful strength, the goods in their hands as collateral, daily cash flow, and the support of Taiping Money House, they would still be able to deal with it. They would not be forced to liquidate and use their business shares and land to pay it off. Thus, the problem that had been placed in front of Fan Xian was how to quickly reduce the value of the Ming family's cash flow and cause serious problems for the Ming family's cash flow. Against such an enormous business of the Ming family, no matter how much money they had, it would still be difficult to achieve this goal. However, the problem was that Fan Xian had full control over the palace treasury. He had a death grip on the supply of goods. It was the same as having the Ming family by the throat. The first to act was Su Wenmao. With the full cooperation of the deputy of the Palace Treasury Transport Envoy, Ren Shaoen's cousin, and the skillful arrangements of a few old shopkeepers in Qingyu Hall, the production of the 3 large workshops in the Palace Treasury had gradually and steadily increased since the end of last summer. The quality had also increased greatly. With more goods sold, there would naturally be more to eat. The Ming family would not let go of this opportunity. Additionally, during this time, the Overwatch Council's harassment of the Ming family had been greatly relaxed. Thus, the entire Ming family business had come alive. In a moment, they had swallowed up countless goods and sent them in the direction of Dongyi and Xuanzhou. Although such a large amount of goods had used up a great deal of the Ming family's money, Ming Qingda was not worried. Once they changed hands, there would be money coming in. This was also the reason why he felt so relaxed during that time. If it continued like this, what wonderful days it would be. However, the 3 large workshops of the Palace Treasury Transport Company had suddenly stopped for some reason. After the news of the stoppage reached Suzhou, Ming Qingda flew into a rage. He had Ming Lanshe quickly go to the Palace Treasury Transport Company Yamen and ask what had happened. Hong Qingda shamelessly accepted his questions. He was only willing to say that the 3 large workshops were undergoing routine equipment maintenance and needed to wait for a few hours. The Ming family had the right to be angry and roar because he was a royal merchant who had bid out tens of thousands of liang of silver. Since the palace treasury had accepted his bid, they had to ensure his channel of goods. Otherwise, he could go to court before the emperor. However, Hong Changqing also had an excuse to delay. The goods the 3 large workshops had shipped last year had already fulfilled their share of the bidding documents. Even if they stopped for 10 days to half a month, the Ming family would have already received all the goods they should have received. Ming Qingda had no choice. He could only use the power of the officialdom to find out the real news in Manchu. With great difficulty, he came back with news. He heard that the 3 large workshops had started a strike again. Sir Su of the Overwatch Council had chopped off the heads of over 20 people before barely managing to suppress it. However, this would delay work for many days. Only after learning of this reason did the Ming family let out a breath. As long as it was not Fan Xian's scheme, it was fine. They began to wait for the day the palace treasury would resume work. The reason the Ming family was so impatient and nervous was all because everything had been going well in the past 2 months. The Ming family had gradually come to accept the palace treasury's ability to deliver goods. Based on the daily amount, they had signed large contracts with Dongyi and overseas. The contract had already expired. The Ming family needed large amounts of goods. What merchants needed was credibility. The Ming family would rather lose money than not have any goods to sell. After another few days, the 3 large workshops finally resumed work. However, there was not much of the various goods they produced. It was like trying to put out a cart of firewood with a cup of water. No one knew when they would return to last year's situation. For a moment, the Ming family sank into a small panic. In order to complete the contracts, they had no choice but to move goods from all over the place. Not only did they move the last of the family's reserves, they also had no choice but to borrow some goods at a high price from the shops on the north and south roads. After receiving the accounts master's report, Ming Qingda estimated the amount of cash available to the family. He furrowed his brows and said, "What exactly does Fan Xian want to do? Does he want to destroy me just by taking a few days of my goods? That is too childish." Ming Lanshe listened to the side with a bitter taste in his mouth. These few days, he had secretly moved a sum of silver from Zhaoshang Money House in preparation to participate in the illicit salt business. His partner this time was Jiangnan's largest salt merchant, Yang Jimei. Furthermore, he knew that Yang Jimei and Governor Shueqing had a close relationship, so Ming Lanshe was not worried about anything. However, the return on the illicit salt would take at least 3 months. If his father knew that he had moved the family's cash flow to another place, would he still be as confident as he was now? "The Ming family doesn't have anything else, but we have silver," Ming Qingda smiled coldly. If Fan Xian wants to control the price of goods on the market to eat our silver, then we'll give it to him to eat. In any case, he'll still have to spit it all back out in the future. We must complete this order. However, the Overwatch Council's actions were not as simple as controlling the price of goods. On the second day after the Ming family successfully gathered the goods at a high price, the workers of the three workshops became excited as if they had taken ephedrine. The palace treasury's operations suddenly exploded. There was not a trace of strike. In a very short amount of time, they reached a new peak in daily output. Although the prices of the goods sold by the royal merchants were set by the court, the selling prices were controlled by the upstream suppliers. At this moment, the prices of the goods had dropped, but business was much better. The Lingnan Xiong family, Sun family, and even Xia Mingji had made a lot of money from this wave of market prices. Mainly, they had earned a lot of the difference in prices from the Ming family. The Ming family had worked hard to gather the high-priced goods and fulfilled most of the orders. However, they watched helplessly as the prices of the goods on the market dropped. They were unspeakably angry, particularly when a few foreigners who had sailed from Xuanzhou shamelessly ran away and turned to Lingnan to pick up the cheaper goods. This caused the Ming family to throw away a large pile of high-priced porcelain and perfume in their hands. In just this one battle, the Ming family had lost 700,000 liang of cash flow. If this had been before, this 700,000 liang would not have been much for the Jiang and Ming family. However, after being suppressed by the Overwatch Council with all their might for a year, the Ming family circulation channels had long run dry. They were completely relying on the support of the Taiping and Zhaoshang money houses. Now, another 700,000 liang of cash flow had melted like snowflakes and disappeared. The master of the Ming family, Ming Qingda, had no choice but to be cautious. This order must be delivered. Although Shi Bao is a foreigner, he also has a large foreign trading company behind him. He will not be as shameless as those islanders. He is also trustworthy. Ming Qingda rubbed his tired eyes and said to his son below, "Launcher, this time you will personally deliver the goods. You must be careful." Ming Launcher made a sound of acknowledgement. He also knew that this batch of goods was very important. This batch of goods was something his father had thought of every method and used countless connections to snatch from the palace treasury. The so-called trial goods referred to the goods that the palace treasury had successfully developed for the first time. Just like the strong alcohol and perfume of the past, although the price was very high, everyone knew that it was something new. Once it was sold, it could be sold like gold. The trial goods this time were a batch of mirrors. Ming Launcher had personally inspected the goods. The main material of these mirrors was glass, but the back was made of some unknown material. It was actually plated with a layer of silver. When it shone on it, it was clear to the finest detail. It was truly a treasure. Logically speaking, given the relationship between Fan Xian and the Ming family, it would not be the Ming family's turn to make a fortune from such an important trial goods. However, the Ming family had been operating in Jiangnan for a long time. They had only bought this batch of goods through another royal merchant. However, Ming Launcher still had a bad feeling in his heart. If this batch of silver mirrors could be safely delivered to Shi Bao's hands in Xuanzhou, the Ming family's difficult cash flow situation could be greatly alleviated. But would it go so smoothly? "Don't worry about anything," Ming Qingda said with a dark expression. Ming Qingda said with a dark face, "I have already communicated with the capital. You will personally escort this batch of goods. The Jiaozhou Navy has also given orders. This time, we will not go out to sea ourselves. Although we will earn less, it should be safe to travel between the provinces." This master of the Ming family, who had already tolerated Fan Xian for an entire year, suddenly raised his head and said in a cold voice, "If someone really dares to kill and steal the goods, we can't kill everyone. If someone escapes, we will go to the capital to fight in court." 3 days later, on a small mountain heading southeast from Suzhou, Hong Changqing looked at the long line of carriages at the foot of the mountain and smiled. There were not many carriages carrying the silver mirrors. There were only 2 carriages, but the Ming family had sent out 500 private soldiers to escort them. Indeed, they placed great importance on this export order. However, His smile immediately faded and turned into coldness. In this moment, he thought of a year ago, the day the Jiaozhou Navy had massacred on the island. He thought of the corpse-eating seabirds and the pirate brothers on the island who had died with their eyes wide open. Although from the beginning, he had been an Overwatch Council secret agent responsible for going to the island to investigate, after spending a long time on the island with those pirates, he would always have some feelings. Thus, he stood on the mountain and looked down at the Ming family's carriages and private soldiers. A joyful and bloody smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He would not kill anyone today, but it would certainly hurt Ming Qingdao more than killing these people. Just as he was thinking, a group of about 200 riders escorting a few carriages walked over from the official road directly opposite the Ming family. The two sides met and blocked the foot of the mountain. Ming Launcher had been carefully watching the situation on the road. Looking at this group of people, he immediately sensed a strange atmosphere. He ordered his private soldiers to pull out their weapons and prepare to meet the enemy. However, the 200 riders did not move. They only coldly brushed past the Ming family carriages. Although these riders were standing on their horses, a cold and stern aura emanated from their bodies. It made the Ming family's private soldiers afraid to move rashly. Just as the two carriages merged into two lines, the side compartments of the carriages escorted by the 200 riders suddenly broke. The carriages escorted by 200 riders suddenly had their sides broken. Everything inside spilled out and crashed onto the carriage the Ming family used to store the silver mirrors. If it was normal goods, what was there to be afraid of? The problem was the things that smashed onto the carriages holding the silver mirrors were rolling stones, very heavy and angular rolling stones. No one dared to use their bodies to block it, not even the Ming family's private soldiers with strict orders. After a few muffled booms, there came countless fine shattering sounds. Ming Launcher screamed and quickly dismounted from his horse to check. He saw that most of the 100 or so silver mirrors had been crushed into shards of shining lenses. Although they still reflected an enchanting light, the official road at the foot of the mountain immediately descended into chaos. Countless people pulled out their weapons. The two sides faced each other. A great battle was about to break out at any moment. Ming Launcher's vision darkened. He immediately knew it was over. He turned his head fiercely and stared at the leader of the 200 riders. Gritting his teeth, he said, "As expected, when did the proper Black Knights of the Overwatch Council do such things as killing people and stealing goods?" The leader's face was covered by a silver mask. He was not surprised that the young master of the Ming family could recognize the identity of his group. They had not planned to hide their identities today. Jinggu, the deputy commander of the Black Knights of the Overwatch Council, gazed at Ming Launcher and coldly said, "I did not kill anyone or steal goods. I was escorting the stone materials needed by the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury through here. You civilian merchants dared to block the way. The road is narrow and unfortunately overturned. Both sides have suffered losses. I don't want you to compensate. Don't make a ruckus. If you anger my fierce nature, I'll take your heads carefully." Ming Launcher's gaze was slightly dim. He looked at the Black Knights, who seemed eager to try, covered in a bloody aura. He forcefully pushed down the anger in his chest. He only felt the taste of blood in his throat. With wide eyes, he said in pain and absent-mindedness, "Overturned. How could a carriage overturn so accurately in this world? Both sides suffered losses. No matter how your stone was overturned, it would not lose a corner, while mine was a fragile silver mirror." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.